Dishes piling up in the sink, laundry strewn all about your house, unwashed or unfolded, layers of dust on everything, no time to clean? In today's fast-paced, high-energy, go-go-go world, you might not have the time to keep your home as tidy and neat as you want. We get it. You're an on-the-go move maker whose wheelings and dealings leave no time for cleanings. When the work week is over, you don't have the energy to tackle washing dishes, doing laundry, or cleaning the floors. You need a break. Introducing Zolpidem, now with our patented self-transforming machine elves. Our sleep aid will put your mind in a non-disruptible state of comfort, during which our little fractal friends will appear and get to work on all those pesky things you don't have time for. Watch in amazement as they all gather up the detritus, dust, and debris from your floor while you lay nearly comatose and unable to move. Before you know it, the weekend has passed and it's time to get back to the grind. No need to worry about whatever transpired over the last 48 hours. Warning: side effects of Zolpidem include nausea, headache, fatigue, restlessness, restfulness, dizziness, heightened awareness of external entities who come crawling out of the floor and electrical outlets to participate in various activities while you remain unable to move or even scream in terror, back pain, abnormal dreams, the sound of elves laughing or talking at high volume, chest pain, confusion, and occasional visits to hyperspace. Zolpidem, isn't it time you take some time for you?
Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody. I am one of the co-hosts.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Will.
We are without Kate today, so it's just the three of us, and we are going to be talking about chapters 28 through 30 of Bleeding Edge. As usual, I want to start with y'all's just general thoughts on these three chapters.
So first, I'm going to probably get into some general thoughts about the book that I have, and then kind of move into my thoughts on these chapters. We've discussed Jonathan Franzen's opinion on this novel and how he kind of laments that Thomas Pynchon never developed a late style like authors like DeLillo and others did and have. And what I've been thinking about for a few weeks now is saying what I'm about to say is maybe a bit odd, given that these chapters cover 9/11. But Pynchon's just kind of having fun in this book. I've been kind of trying to puzzle out the tone of this book and why there's so many jokes and stuff. I just kind of realized that Pynchon's just kind of, like I said, having fun. The jokes per page ratio in this book is probably higher than his other books. I would imagine, because it was kind of confusing me, why Maxine seems to kind of let everything slide off her back, and why the tone of this is what it is. And then I just kind of realized, I think Pynchon's just kind of having a good time while he's writing it. And then the other thing I had prepared, just kind of generally, is to go back to, I think, chapter like 2 or 3, where Philip K. Dick's our friends from Frolic 6, or our friends from Frolic 8, is referenced in terms of the borderline personality disorder get together. And I did read Our Friends from Frolic 8, and I think I found out why Pynchon references it. Our Friends from Frolic 8, I think, came out in 1970, which would have been 3 years before Gravity's Rainbow. And both Gravity's Rainbow and Our Friends from Frolic 8 address the theory or the notion that acausality, or like the cause and effect, are kind of a false dichotomy, or not a dichotomy, but a false thing in science and stuff. They both kind of address that to move forward in science, to move forward as a society and as a civilization, we maybe need to stop thinking about cause and effect and start thinking in some other way. Neither of those books kind of address what would come after leaving behind cause and effect, but I do think that's why that Pynchon references Our Friends from Frolic 8, which I think is pretty interesting. I mean, I'll probably bring that back up once we cover Gravity's Rainbow, but I did kind of puzzle out why that reference is in there, at least in my opinion. So to get to these chapters, I really like these chapters. There's some of the best prose in this book are in these chapters. Each chapter kind of has at least one kind of prose-centered paragraph that's really beautiful. 9/11 obviously happens in these chapters. In chapter 29, chapter 28, we get a really, the party is really fun. I really like the party. There's a lot of cool stuff in there. These might be my favorite chapters so far. Maybe almost certainly they are. He does address, it's a pretty in-depth look at 9/11 and the aftermath in these chapters. And I do also like, like the NFL references and stuff. The toilet song is pretty good. And yeah, I really like these chapters.
I want to circle back real quick before we get to Will's thoughts on the chapters. Just regarding your mention of Pynchon having a lot of fun with this book, and I'm kind of, that's got me thinking now, and I'm not disagreeing with that. I certainly think that he is. I'm just trying to think of what the reason for that might be, especially given this book's recency. It's takes place more recently than any of his other works did. It's obviously the last one he's published. The first thing that comes to mind, I think, as far as the reason for that, I'm kind of on two different wavelengths here. I'm wondering if this is because he kind of knows this is his last work and he wants to have, a sort of high note to go out on, not just in terms of, writing a good book, but also of just giving us a book that he clearly had fun writing in light of the very heavy, content that goes on here, especially, now that we're talking about these chapters. On the other hand, I have to wonder if the sort of lightness of, maybe lightness isn't the best way of approaching that, but the sort of levity with which he handles all of this is because at this point in his career, he's spent his entire career as a writer trying to point out to the people reading his books and more, here are where things are going wrong. Here is where, historically we have these major shifts in the cultural zeitgeist or in history itself, these momentous events that these books are all kind of centered around. And he's using those as a point of kind of showing us, like, here's where we messed up. Maybe we can turn and right the ship. But then it happened again here, and then it happened again here. And at this point, is he just kind of, hands in the air, I've done everything I can. No one really seems to want to have much interest in making a change, especially when you look at what this book is talking about. The internet being a new thing and the opportunity to use the internet as a platform to make this huge change. But we just went back to the old ways of how can we make money on this and how can we utilize this to, increase the power and the hold that the government has on the people that it governs. So I'm glad you brought that up, because now I have that to chew on for the rest of this book.
Yeah, and I think there's a different line between his first three books and then Vineland and what comes after Vineland in terms of, how much fun he's having and how it does seem to be kind of especially from Vineland onwards, like a kind of laugh to keep from crying at like aspect of the work.
Yeah.
Where he's definitely lamenting, all of these turning points in history where things kind of seem to have gotten worse, or like these stuff like that. And like I said, I mean, the jokes per page thing is maybe the strongest argument for my whole Pynchon's having fun thing, because he treats, as we've gone over on this podcast, he treats some very serious subjects with a lot of levity and with a lot of lack of seriousness. And I do think that kind of does play into what I was saying with the laugh to keep from crying thing, and that also could play into the whole 9/11 thing. With 9/11 is obviously a very serious thing that happened, and Pynchon was presumably either in New York City or was in New York City shortly before or after, if not there that day. So he probably has some trauma related to it and stuff. 9/11 is treated pretty seriously, but it's not like the jokes stop in chapter 29 or anything. So
Yeah.
Yeah, to kind of weirdly tie this conversation back into a kind of a somewhat obvious thing that I missed in last episode, I brought up torque effects and kind of the inscrutability of that business name. And I missed the fact that there's, this thing that I knew of called the torque effect, which is it's a specific example of, Newton's third law of motion, that basically means that when you have torque going through a rotor, especially in the context of like a helicopter, you're going to have twisting happening on the motor end. And I really do see all of the levity in this book as an example of the massive extrapolation of the laugh to keep from crying. It is, you need to have that balancing so that it's not just incredibly dark. Because I would say that this is maybe his darkest book, period. It's not like in terms of actual content, but in terms of tone, in terms of thematic workings, it feels like an old man throwing up his hands, kind of like both of you alluded to. It feels like somebody saying, I told you so, and I fucking wish I was wrong.
Yeah.
And especially these chapters feel like they are heartbreaking, for me at least, to read through. Because the party is fun, but it's so full of signifiers that to me read as just like horrible things. We'll get into more specifics as we go through the conversation, but just these three chapters are maybe the darkest section of his entire bibliography.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I really enjoyed reading them. To Luke's point earlier, there is a lot of really great prose in these chapters. The party chapter is a lot of fun to read, and then it just gets real dark after that. And and you really, even 28 there is darkness there, because as a reader we know what's coming. We know what's literally around the corner, and there's that sort of dread of it coming, even though you know it's coming. So I think that really adds to the tension that's been building up and to the moment of the attacks happens. And then I think the writing in chapters 28 or 29 and 30 is incredibly well done, especially considering that we're handling something that at the time that this book came out happened just over 10 years prior. It's still really fresh in a lot of people's minds, especially the people who were directly impacted by it. For any of us, myself included, I was in high school when that happened, and I still have very vivid memories of that day. And thankfully I didn't personally lose anybody, and I wasn't there when it happened. That was such a momentous thing, and it was so impactful that it reverberated around the world. And I think to write about it, especially in a fiction book, to incorporate that as a major plot point really takes a skillful hand to do it properly. Because if you don't handle that well, it's not going to bode well for the rest of your story. And he does a very, very good job of describing the event itself, and the confusion and the chaos that came from it, and the anger that came from it on some parts as well. Reading it, it really brought back a lot of memories for me. Watching that happen on the news, and kind of the surreal feeling that was going on at the time. And so, I think it really balances very well between being just, an entertaining and enjoyable section of chapters to read, and for presenting a very heavy event in history very well, and in a way that doesn't feel like it's, being shoehorned in for just the purposes of having it in the story. It's there, and it needed to happen, and it helps tell the story that he's telling.
Yeah, it really goes to in favor of the argument that I've seen quite a few people share online. It seems that Pynchon kind of starts with the historical events and works backward, because I'm not sure how you could write this book without 9/11 being the central aspect of it. Because there's all the higher concept discussions we've had about it, but really none of it makes sense without that event.
Absolutely. So chapter 28, we open on the party that Maxine was invited to earlier. She is on her way there with Horst. I absolutely love the opening two paragraphs. I think that, it really sets the tone for where this is going. And again, knowing what's coming is just kind of adds this uncomfortable kind of dread, I think, for me at least, as I'm reading this chapter. Like, yeah, everyone's having a good time, and there's a lot of funny things that are happening while this is going on, but knowing what's about to happen and seeing everyone just unaware and oblivious of it is just kind of a really interesting way to frame the chapter. We move through the party. Maxine kind of takes note of everything that's going on, and we finally actually get our first mention of Josh Harris in here. But before that, there's a couple of things that I wanted to touch on as far as what is being referenced within this particular chapter. So we get a mention of what's referred to as Razorfish alumni. I didn't really have much knowledge of this. I looked it up. The Pynchon wiki gives a pretty good summarization of what that is referring to. But Kate actually wrote up some pretty interesting notes and sent them over to me. So I'll just read what she wrote regarding that. She says, the choice of Razorfish here seems very purposeful. Not only were they one of the first companies to form Silicon Alley, but they're also famous for a 60 Minutes interview in February of 2000 in which they were unable to answer the question, what do you do? The founder said, we recontextualize what it means to be a serious business. We provide services to businesses to help them win, and we radically transform businesses to invent and reinvent them. That interview and the accompanying profile on the Silicon Alley companies were largely viewed as a disaster and helped kick off the dot-com crash by killing investor confidence in the new tech sector. As if that isn't enough, Razorfish also provides a view to the gentrification themes of the novel. When they were founded, they put their offices in freshly renovated building in Alphabet City, which was considered a very troubled, crime-ridden, economically depressed area. According to Meet Me in the Bathroom, which Kate has been talking about a lot, and I know I need to read that, each of the streets correspond to a different kind of crime, ranging from guns, drugs, or prostitution, including helpful jingles like Avenue A, you're adventurous, Avenue B, you're brave, Avenue C, you're crazy, Avenue D, you're dead. Most of the early rock revival acts in New York, like The Strokes and Death from Above, records lived there due to its cheap rents and artistic community. The arrival of Razorfish and others began the process of gentrification in the neighborhood. So this ties into a lot of what's been going on prior in these earlier chapters of, we've mentioned before how all this sort of tech, the .com boom and everything like that really wasn't, they were selling essentially ideas, which is insane. But they made a lot of money doing it, and then they ended up losing a lot of money doing it, but no one really cared because they made a bunch of money, and the people who made money kept that money, and it didn't really have any impact on them. But it did also lead to the gentrification of large portions of New York City, which has been, a topic that's come up several times within the book as a whole, and continues to happen up to now in 2024. It's a really interesting, kind of aside that he makes, but there's a lot of context that lives within that specific idea and those people being at this particular party. I did really enjoy it. As Luke mentions, the prose in here is absolutely stunning at times. I particularly liked the paragraph that starts, even though the dot-com bubble. Do either of you want to read that section real quick?
Even though the dot-com bubble, once an eye-catching ellipsoid, now droops in vivid pink collapse over the trembling chin of the era, perhaps no more than a vestige of shallow breath left inside it, no expense tonight has been spared. The theme of the gathering, officially 1999, has a darker subtext of denial. It soon becomes clear that everybody's pretending for tonight that they're still in the pre-crash fantasy years, dancing in the shadow of last year's dreaded Y2K, now safely history, but according to this consensual delusion, not quite upon them yet. With here remaining freeze-framed back at the Cinderella moment of midnight of the millennium, when in the next nanosecond the world's computers will fail to increment the year correctly and bring down the apocalypse. What passes for nostalgia in a time of widespread attention deficit disorder. People have pulled their premillennial t-shirts back out of the archival plastic they've been idling in. Y2K is near, Armageddon Eve. Y2K compliant love machine, I survived. Determined, as Prince can be heard repeatedly urging, to party like it's 1999.
Yeah, I love that particular section as far as, really introducing us to the party that's going on here. And this absolutely feels like a pseudo party. If anyone has not yet seen the What We Do in Public documentary, I I know Kate has urged everyone to watch it. I loved it. I would definitely encourage the same. This is exactly the kind of parties that they were throwing. There is a sort of, I like this darker subtext of denial here. Everyone's kind of living in the past and not at the same time. They're stuck in this, this time where everything was ideal for them and before the sort of turn where everything starts crashing, and they're living in that moment, but at the same time they're still, embracing everything that they're able to take advantage of while they're there and able to take advantage of it. So it's a really fun way to bring us into this party and set the tone for everything that is going to occur within this chapter.
It's funny to me that you call it fun, not because it isn't it's an enjoyably written paragraph, one of my favorites in this section, but it is to me, I mean, it feels like the most foreshadowing paragraph in
for
this
sure.
chapter.
Yeah,
because I mean, we'll get into it in chapter 30, but the themes of denial and the themes of like eternal, the denial of death in both the philosophical and psychological sense, as well as the sociological, cultural one. I think that's really what it's getting at, and it's just so heavy for me.
mm-hmm.
And it's very fun to think of a time as somebody who was not really sentient for it, a time where people were taking like Y2K as semi-seriously as it seems like people did.
Oh, they absolutely did.
Because, a year prior to this book's release, we had the whole 2012 thing.
Yep.
But realistically, nobody except for some very specific cult members and leaders were actually taking it seriously as an event. Yeah.
Yeah, Y2K was a wild thing to have lived through. But the build up to it, there really was this sort of mass hysteria that existed at the time. And I think a lot of that was able to proliferate because of the fact that the internet was still at that point kind of in its infancy. So the ability to really spread information quickly and to a lot of people wasn't as available at that time. And it would be interesting to see how another thing like that would occur, nowadays, and how that would kind of turn out. But at the time it happened, it was weird. It was really interesting to live through.
Yeah, I remember 1999 turning into 2000 as well, pretty strongly. I do remember in the lead up, I used to read a lot of the newspaper a lot and a lot of magazines, and it was a thing in the national news media to kind of address Y2K, whether or not it was a thing or not.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, my family did not buy into the whole thing. I don't think I had friends that bought into it, or their families really bought into it. So I was surrounded by people who were skeptical about it, which meant that as a I think 11 or 12-year-old, I was not super worried about it. But I do remember that New Year's Eve. I do remember being kind of scared, like when it hit midnight, that the world would end. Just kind of that, like, I don't really know how to describe it, but it was just kind of like in the back of my mind, like that what if was just kind of hanging around.
Yeah.
I don't, yeah, because there's not really a modern equivalent to it that I could point to for people that are younger or anything. But it was, I mean, nobody really knew what would happen for sure. I think. I mean, looking back on it, it is kind of dumb to think that, it's like the year being 00 at the end would like make computers mess up. It's not like computers really like care or realize. I think that was basically the basis of it, was that computers would think the world had ended or something. I don't.
Basically, they would all shut down simultaneously, and yeah.
Which doesn't really make sense. I mean, even from what little I know about computers and computer science, it doesn't really make sense. But it was, there was a good amount of hysteria around that time about it. So
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, just to head off people contacting us, because for some reason this is the most virulent strain of you were wrong on the internet even these days. But just to explain so that people don't explain at us, the the computers don't care about the years ticking over in that sense, but basically the systems that almost everything uses on the back end, the Unix time clock, was originally designed by like literally just like random hackers in a lab. And so they just conveniently set the start of the clock at 1900. and they only set enough addressing space to go to the year 2000 because they didn't expect that, this hobby system that they were developing, which turned into Unix, they were developing just so that they wouldn't have to pay for licensing of a different system, was ever going to be used for anything but their own experiments. And so, in theory, yes, it could have caused issues. However, those issues would have been limited to, banking computers shutting down and having the wrong date. Or literally like digital clocks shutting down. Like it wouldn't have caused any of these issues. And it's interesting that you mentioned the whole our friends from Frolics 8 correlation with Gravity's Rainbow, because a lot of what this paragraph and this kind of discussion of Y2K to me is getting at is like the way that not necessarily we confuse correlation and causation, or that we assume that because there is an association between something, that because there is a cause, there will be an effect that is always predictable, but more just the general epistemic idea of people confusing the scales of these things. Because no, even if IT people hadn't spent, the previous decade shoring up things, changing the epoch date on Unix systems from 1900 to 1968, that like planes would not have fallen out of the sky. It was like this weird correlation of, or like a combination of a moral panic and conspiracy theories, where it just none of these disaster scenarios would have happened. The worst case scenario would have been like stock exchanges failing, but on an infrastructure level, there wouldn't have been any cause. It doesn't cause anything except for the computer to shut down in the worst case scenario. And that's just it's a fascinating idea that people can get so caught up in these ideas of, well, we do all of our banking on computers these days, so if the computer shut down, the banks will therefore stop working. As though people can't just like people reuse calendars, even though the dates are different. And the days, like people have been dealing with that kind of issue for as long as humans have been naming things. There's always been a displacement between those concepts, between the name and the thing itself. And it's just deeply funny to reflect on a time where people just believed so hard in the computers and the computerization that they thought that for some reason it would actually shut everything down. And I do feel like we haven't gotten away from that. If anything, it's kind of gotten worse in our cultural mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, we continue to move through the party. There's some really great description of the actual building itself and the bar that's in there. And I do like, Will, that you mentioned how that paragraph we read earlier is kind of foreshadowing for what's to come in the next chapter. Especially because at the end of page 303, there's a mention of how it says, later those who were here will remember mostly how vertical it all was. The stairwells, the elevators, the atria, the shadows that seemed to plunge from overhead and repeated assaults on the gatherings and ungatherings beneath. The dancers semi-stunned under the strobing, not dancing exactly, more like standing in one place and moving up and down in time to the music. I mean, that verticality, the you can't help but think of the towers, in that moment, and the how all of this is about to come to a very dark and disturbing event. And so, yeah, there's a lot of interesting foreshadowing that's going on in here. Maxine and Horst end up running into several people, the first of which is Verva, at which point Horst kind of makes his way out and wanders through the crowd, which there's a description of him blending into the crowd as described as temporal aliasing, which I absolutely love that description. That is a really cool way to describe him sort of making his way and blending into the scenery. For anyone unfamiliar, aliasing has to do with, it can be, audio or visual. It's typically with visual images and video where the signal gets distorted to a point where it starts to blur a little bit. And so that description of Horst essentially blending and blurring into the crowd is just beautiful writing. I absolutely love that. We get again the first actual by name mention of Josh Harris at this party when Lucas mentions specifically the party, Millennium Eve party at Pseudo. Eric finds Maxine throughout here, our good friend who is not really described how he's dressed in here, which I'm kind of disappointed by, if I'm being honest, because Eric is such an interesting character. I was hoping for some kind of a description of what god awful clothing he had decided to wear. But he, of course, without surprise, he does mention Maxine's choice of shoes, and Maxine snaps back at him with some obscure shoe designers, because I had to look these up. I had no idea what that was referring to, but Giuseppe Zanotti, Stuart Weitzman, those are, and Jimmy Choo, those are all shoe designers. They end up wandering through a number of interesting bathrooms, which leads to the song "In the Toilet," which I'm curious about y'all's. We've talked before about the couple of songs that are in here, and I'm curious for y'all's opinion on this one. I hadn't thought of it when I was reading it, but when I went and hopped on the Pynchon wiki, they mentioned that this plugs in perfectly to Elvis's "In the Ghetto," which when I went back and reread it, just added a really fun layer to that song.
Yeah, somebody in the Reddit group read linked to a cover that they did of the song, which I actually found pretty enjoyable.
Oh, really? I'll have to find that and put
Yeah,
it in the show notes. That's hilarious.
it's pretty funny. It's like an electric. They do like an electric cover of it, electronic. I do like this song a good amount. I think I'm a bigger fan of Pynchon's songs than maybe anyone else in this podcast. But yeah, I don't. I mean, it's a funny song. Does kind of cover a lot of the stuff that goes on in bathrooms and bars, and I don't know. It's also just kind of comedic in general that there's a page-long song about what goes on in toilets. So
Yeah, as I've mentioned before, I kind of feel like the songs in this book strike a more realistic chord than most of his previous songs. And this one, I can totally imagine some like electro swing person writing this and putting it to music like that. This is the least absurd of any of his songs, except for the earlier one in this book that just kind of felt like a normal blues song. It's just it really does strike right down the middle in terms of all those things, and it is just funny, and I'm going to have to listen to that cover.
Yeah, I found the link that that Luke was talking about, and I'm going to put it in the show notes for anyone who's curious. And I'm going to have to listen to it later myself because, I really enjoyed the song itself. Like you said, Will, like I think that the songs in this book are among his strongest. I would hesitate to say that I'm a fan of all of his songs in his books. I feel like I think we've brought this up before, but I think when he uses them effectively is when I enjoy them the most. I feel like there's a lot of times where they kind of feel like they're just in there because he had an idea and thought it was, funny to put that in there. And so that's why it's there. And I tend to be kind of lukewarm on those at best, but I don't think there's a song in Bleeding Edge that I didn't enjoy. So I think as a whole, this is probably the one book of his that I do enjoy all of the songs that are contained within it.
Yeah, and I love the way that this song kind of acts as a kind of a break just directly into Maxine's mind, where this whole book, as I've said many times, not to sound like a broken record, is a lot of it is mediated through Maxine's perspective. But prior to this, you have this whole section about this postmodern toilet that is just a deeply funny image and also kind of beautiful, but it's so self-aware and it's so much like, well, this is what Thomas Pynchon would write about as like a way to lampoon his own writing style. And then you have this ridiculous song that segues directly into clearly Maxine's reminiscence of the club toilets. I mean, it's dated as much. Teen contemporaries of Maxine's got lost in the club toilets of the 80s, went in, never came out. Some with luck grew too hip or not hip enough to appreciate the scene at all. Others, like Maxine, went on, so on and so forth. And it's a really good use of the song as like an actual literary device for once, rather than simply a gag or as table setting.
So, and then, from there, Maxine ends up running into Felix, who is wearing a t-shirt with a Canadian Maple Leaf logo and the A team written on it, which I adored that joke, probably more than I should have. I just thought that was hilarious. They have a back and forth about how much Felix was involved in what happened to Lester. I'm kind of curious what y'all thought of that exchange. I thought it was an interesting dialogue between those two, and going, Maxine, I think, clearly knows or at least strongly feels that Felix had more of a hand in what happened to Lester than he is willing to admit to. Did y'all have any particular thoughts on that?
I, for one, really enjoy the way that Felix is kind of cast as this ultra Montreal figure from the A team Maple Leaf logo shirt to the whole. If somebody resists poutine, they resist life. And having known a few people from urban Quebec, I mean, it's not that far off from the general attitude they take when they're away from home. Don't blame them.
Yeah.
I mean, poutine is that good.
I've not had it, so I don't know. So I don't. I guess I can't. Felix would probably think pretty lowly of me as a result. But I think I live too far south. I don't know how readily available poutine is the further away from Canada you get.
I mean, I've seen it on restaurant menus and stuff in America.
Yeah, I mean, I've never had it in Quebec, so I'm sure many people would argue I've never had it. But it is one of my favorite foods, and there's a reason that it's not a universally loved cuisine. And it's not just a matter of like, as Pynchon really gets into with pretty much all of his post-Vineland stuff with the lampooning of diet culture. But frankly, there is no world in which fried potatoes with gravy and cheese curds is like remotely healthy.
Yeah.
But it is delicious.
True. I mean, most things that are unhealthy are, right?
Well, I can think of some exceptions, but the ones that people eat, yeah, absolutely. But I also think it's because up until this point, Felix, after Lester disappears, there's a bit of a shade over him. But up until that point, Felix Boingo is kind of viewed as a likable guy who doesn't have any red marks against him. He just seems like a decent person who was willing to help out Maxine once she, hung out with him for a while. Didn't even do any of the indiscretions that, you come to expect from people in those situations, especially in a noir tinted, flashback. But here we have a fascinating, as I've highlighted before, this kind of very much gray area of, if you believe Maxine's perspective, if you believe that Lester was killed by these people for this reason, whatever that reason may be, Felix is probably in on it. And at the same time, you can totally see his perspective of just being a guy at a party who's run into someone who he has reason to believe would have these kinds of suspicions. And it's a total cipher. I don't think you can pull anything out of this section as far as like viewing his complicity or not.
No, I don't think you can at all. I think it's an interesting way of just kind of, like you mentioned, that connection to the noir flashback and everything like that. I think this is so often in those stories, we as the viewer or the reader don't have enough information really, or at least enough verifiable information to determine that person's complicity in whatever it is that they're being accused of. The person themselves, I think you summarized it perfectly well. Like, whether or not he knew or didn't know, we don't know, but he's certainly, he's made his stance on it and he's said what he said. Maxine knows the limited amount that she knows. I think more of this is, it's a gut feeling that she has. And I think there's a level of desperation that she wants to be able to put the pieces together. And this kind of, I think, connects with a lot of what this book is kind of touching at, is that, sometimes we just won't know the answers to these kind of things. And it's an incredibly frustrating and upsetting situation to be in, especially when you could extrapolate this out to, the government's complicity in something like 9/11. How much did they know? How much of it could have been prevented? Did they know anything? Could they have prevented? There's so many questions that we will probably never have the answer to, and all we can do is make these sort of desperate grasps based on the limited information that we have, which is often information that we can't really verify at the end of the day. We're kind of taking information that's gone through so many levels of filters that it's almost either been sterilized to the point where you can't really pull anything from it, or it's become so distorted that anything you pull from it can't really hold up to any kind of level of scrutiny.
And this is maybe the most venomous that we see Maxine.
Yeah.
It's, from the moment he walks into the scene, she is just kind of rebuffing every attempt that he has at, gaining information, whether it's, in the naive reading from his perspective of just being a guy at a party trying to make small talk, or it's ever meet him? Come on, I'll introduce you. We've been doing a little business together. Of course you have, bitch. She is not that hostile of a person, and the way that she is hostile is almost always mediated via humor.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just, she feels deeply betrayed, and it's a really excellent kind of unveiling of that betrayal she feels from the beginning of the scene to that point.
Yeah, definitely is. So, and I'm glad you chose that little section of it, because that leads right to where we're going in the plot next. So Felix lets Maxine know that Gabriel Ice is at this party, and tries to get her over to where she can meet him. I love the description that is given of him. His eyes, framed by Oliver People's horn rims, are less expressive than many Maxine had noticed at the fish market, though sometimes a party who may appear immune to desire is in fact oversusceptible, dangerously so. No least idea of how to deal with it once it jumps the fence, as it must, and heads for the ridgeline. Thin and careful lips in the business, you run into far too many of these faces, don't know what they want or how much of it, or what to do with it once they have it. She's finally in a situation where she can confront this person that she's been essentially chasing throughout the book, and trying to get an understanding of, and to basically to pull down from his pedestal. And now here is her opportunity to do so. But when she is introduced to him, he's mid conversation with some people talking about server farms, and Kate left a note on here that I wanted to touch on real quick. Starting with the quote that starts with "My Geek Brothers," Kate mentions Northern expansion is a regular theme in the works of Post-Gravity's Rainbow Thomas Pynchon. In Mason and Dixon, a member of the survey party is secretly a hollow earther. In Pynchon's mythos, there's an entrance to a perfect Edenic hollow earth in the frozen north. Yet as we continue to expand and colonize, the hole shrinks smaller and smaller. We lose the mystery of creation, so the access to that magic otherworld shrinks and shrinks. And against the day where it's next visited, the opening has shrunk almost completely. Now, with modernity having fully arrived, there is no more portal to another realm, no more magic. It's all been closed, and they only want to use the once magical land as a cooling system for the new world, the new frontier that we'll all be forced into as a method of external control. So that's referencing like I mentioned, the ICE is talking about having these server farms set up north to allow the servers to output the tremendous amount of heats that they can put out.
Yeah, as far as the symbolism of that, Kate basically summarized everything I would have said. As far as the heat goes in the server farms, yeah, I mean it's one of those things where people have heard about the DEA searching for indoor weed farms using infrared cameras with on airplanes, and it's very much the same thing with server farms, to the extent that I think in certain regions where things like Bitcoin have been have been banned, they will do the same kind of thing where they'll have basically a chart of, well, these are legitimate data centers, and any hotspot that isn't that is either going to be a Bitcoin farm or some other illicit thing, whether it's drugs or what have you. But I love the way that this is also used and very much situated in the book, which I would argue is late Pynchon is the willingness to situate it within the book instead of just leaving it as historical subtext for anyone who's in the know to catch it. Where, you have this icon of late capitalism in the form of Gabriel Ice, supposing the exact same things as Stalin when he was realizing the limitations of the land he had access to as the head of the USSR.
Yeah, and that segues perfectly into the mention of Godwin's law here, which Pynchon kind of takes and gives it his own little New York twist. But for anyone not aware, Godwin's law is essentially a concept that was brought up and created by, I think it's Michael Godwin. I think that's his first name. And basically the idea is that over enough time, any conversation or discussion or chat online will have someone mention or compare something to Hitler, or in some cases, in this case, Stalin. I can't think of any situation in which that probably isn't true. I think I'm interested to kind of dive into the psychology of that at some point. I think that would be an interesting thing to kind of understand the reason that so often comes up. But that's essentially what it is. And for anyone interested, Godwin actually wrote his college, I think his senior thesis on Pynchon. I wasn't able to find a copy of it anywhere, which, I'm not terribly surprised by that. But he also did write a really good review of Bleeding Edge, which I will leave a link in the show notes for. It's not tremendously long, but I think he does a really good job of kind of summarizing the general themes and concepts that this book is touching on. And it was a really very interesting and well-written review for anyone who cares to give it a look at looking at. So Maxine eventually, even when confronted with this person that she's been, sort of revolving around for the majority of this book, essentially bails. She has an opportunity to confront him and say her piece or make any accusations that she wants to, but she just up and leaves. Before I touch on a couple of things I specifically highlighted on that, I was curious for y'all's thoughts on that. As far as her as a character, does this feel to you that this is in line with her character, or does this feel sort of like a moment of panic for her, like she maybe didn't understand or have any kind of game plan, considering that this all kind of happened so quick, or that she just knew nothing would come of it, nothing good would come of it, at least?
To me, I'm going to connect back to kind of our book discussion about Pynchon's style throughout this entire novel. I really do feel like a lot of Maxine's attitudes throughout this book can be traced back to like trauma response, and as an individual within a culture that has been built around these kinds of traumatic events, like, as has been alluded to many times in this book so far, Pearl Harbor, or the assassination of JFK, or whatever you want to point to, 9/11, as is going to happen in the next chapter. And so I think that this fits within her character in the sense that at a certain point, you can't just sit there and talk to the void. At this point, Maxine has spent almost a year of her life thinking about Gabriel Ice as this kind of archon, this kind of like pseudo demonic, pseudo deistic kind of person who maybe he's just a tool of whatever powers that may be, or maybe he's not, but he's just a guy who's there and who's just going on this rant about how important it is to colonize the Arctic so that you don't have to spend so much on AC. And it's just a moment of like, well, I don't need to talk to this guy. I already know who he is. I already have condensed my thoughts about him. No conversation is going to be anything but a repeat of Felix Boingo's conversation. I'm not going to get anything out of it. At most, I'm just giving him a chance to trample my hopes of finding a bottom to this well. I might as well just leave, having confirmed that he exists at least.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. To kind of build off of that, I think that, yeah, she definitely sees it as, anything that she could or would say to him is not that it's going to be insignificant, but it's not going to change anything. She doesn't have the power to, she can't just walk up to him and arrest him and make him stop everything that he's doing. In a best case scenario, they'll kick her out and throw her out on the street. In a worst case scenario, she ends up taken somewhere and probably killed. But more than likely, if she were to interact with him, if she were to approach him and say something to him, it would go, like you said, exactly like the Felix conversation. It would just be this anger and this vitriol that she's got built up inside of her over all of this is just going to spill out. And yeah, there's nothing that she's going to get from it, nothing that she doesn't already know, other than, like you said, just confirming that, yeah, he's there, and that's all she can really do. So I do think it's absolutely within her character. It was frustrating. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't frustrating that there wasn't that scene, but I think that wouldn't have served the story, and it wouldn't have made Maxine, wouldn't have fit her character.
One thing I do think it's still kind of unclear, like what Gabriel Ice has even done. I mean, it does seem obvious that he was probably direct. Maybe not. Maybe the word directly is not the right word, but he does seem to be involved in the killing of Lester. I think you can like Lester is stealing money from him, and then Lester ends up dead. So it'd be kind of dumb to think that Gabriel Ice had nothing to do with that. But other than that, I can't really think of anything in the book yet so far where it's like a clear smoking gun that Gabriel Ice has even done anything wrong in terms of like provable in a court of law or even.
Yeah, it's all hearsay.
Yeah, it's all hearsay. It's all kind of dots on a map that seem connected to the reader and probably to Maxine. But if she were to kind of lay it all out to a prosecutor or to a layman, that they might not see the same connections that we do or that Maxine does. That being said, yeah, it probably is pretty frustrating for her to be at the same party as him and kind of see him holding court more or less, or kind of going on and having people probably fawn over him and listen to his every word, hang on his every word.
Yeah, I think that the last two sentences, or last two, the two latter sentences in the paragraph after describing kind of the Stalinist angle, it isn't so much that Maxine can't be fooled, it's more that she hates to be, and when she finds anybody trying too hard to fool her, she reaches for her revolver, or in this case, turns and heads for the stairs, leaving Felix and Gabriel Ice to schmooze as they will, rogue to rogue. And I think that's a really good way to kind of outline the fact that as much as throughout this book we've seen like Maxine resenting her aging, as I think most people resent their aging, her casting herself as the Yenta, and even earlier in this chapter, this is just her being an old enough person to understand that if she puts herself in this situation, she might not actually kill the man, but she's gonna get mad enough to consider it. Mm-hmm. And assuming, as she does, that Felix has shared interests with him and was sent to say hi to her so that she would go say hi to Gabriel Ice, she's probably thinking, hey, I'd rather not be put into a situation where I pull a gun on this powerful person in a public space. Even if it's all paranoia, she's probably thinking, I'd rather not be set up in this trap, whatever this trap is, whatever the actual gate is, or whether it's the claws of a bear trap, whatever it is. She doesn't want any part of it, and she's just done.
Yeah, and baked into all of this, there's some really interesting or really good mentions of noir works, not just in this chapter, but in the coming chapters as well. But specifically with this one, she mentions Nora Charles from the Thin Man series that Dashiell Hammett did, which if anyone hasn't watched those films or read the book, I would highly recommend it. The book is great. The film was made into a whole series. I don't even remember how many movies they made, but it's a great comic noir. It's a lot of fun. I would definitely recommend it. But then there's also a mention of Nancy Drew, which earlier Felix alluded to Maxine being a sort of Nancy Drew, which she did not take well. And then, here she's kind of, wondering, well, what would someone like that even do? So it's interesting to see how Maxine is kind of comparing herself to these various level of detectives from literary history. We get a mention of the well-known song to end events of Closing Time by Semisonic, which is very often pretty well misused. I think a lot of I think it's interesting because that song was written, as I understand it, about the singer's girlfriend or wife being pregnant, but that's never what that song is used for. So I don't know if that was an intentional inclusion in there to show the kind of cluelessness of the people that are running this party, or if it just seemed like the appropriate song to play for something like this. I just thought that was an interesting inclusion in there. And that's all buried in a really long and just beautifully written paragraph that almost closes out this chapter. Did anyone want to read that real quick, starting with For Some Reason?
For some reason, however, she manages to stay all night and close the joint down. Horace, perhaps from secondhand smoke, regressing to his old party animal ways, is affably all over the place. Maxine finds herself tangled in and presently refereeing nerd disputes she can't understand a word of. She nods out in the toilet once or twice, and if she dreams at all, it's hard to separate from the great invisible wheeling around her, decelerating, board fading to all but silent, black and white, till at last it's time to CD Tilda home. For recessional music, there's Closing Time by Semisonic, a four-chord farewell to the old century. Former and future nerdistocracy slowly, and to look at them you'd think reluctantly, filtering back out into the street, into the long September, which has been with them in a virtual way since spring before last, continuing only to deepen, putting their street faces back on for it. Faces already under silent assault, as if by something ahead, some Y2K of the work week that no one is quite imagining. The crowds drifting slowly out into the little legendary streets, the highs beginning to dissipate out into the casting off of veils before the luminosities of dawn, a sea of t-shirts no one's reading, a clamor of messages nobody's getting, as if it's the true text of history of nights in the alley, outcries to be attended to and not be lost, the 3 a.m. Cosmo deliveries to code sessions and all-night shredding parties, the bedfellows who came and went, the bands in the clubs, the songs whose hooks still wait to ambush an idle hour, the day jobs with meetings about meetings and bosses without clue, the unreal strings of zeros, the business models changing 1 minute to the next, the startup parties every night of the week and more on Thursdays than you could keep track of. Which of these faces so claimed by the time, the epoch whose end we have been celebrating all night? Which of them can see ahead among the microclimates of binary, tracking earthwide everywhere through dark fiber and twisted pairs, and nowadays wirelessly through spaces private and public, anywhere among cyber sweatshop needles flashing and never still, and that unquiet, vastly stitched and unstitched tapestry they have all at some time sat growing crippled in the service of, the shape of the day imminent, a procedure waiting execution, about to be revealed, a search result with no instructions on how to look for it.
I think that's a great passage to end this party on. You know, as Will mentioned at the beginning of the chapter, the sort of foreshadowing that was taking place with the description of the party and how things were going at that time, but then we're getting the almost opposite of that as the party winds down and everyone is kind of unsure of what to do and where to go, and it really lends to that, you know, that, like Will said, that foreshadowing of what's about to happen. And there's, you know, now there's much more, it's much more present, it's much darker, it's more ominous, it's really, you know, gone from just lurking in the shadows to being right in front of our faces at this point.
Yeah, I really do love that section, and I'm going to jump into a wonderful little. I think it qualifies as conspiracy corner, but it's a teeny little
Ooh,
one.
okay.
Basically, as is mentioned on the Pynchon wiki, uh, there's that whole line of "till it's time at last to CD tilde home." Basically, in Unix systems, CD means change directory, and tilde is an alias, as uh, as is notable to this chapter, for the home directory. It's the equivalent of, where your folders are for documents and pictures on Windows. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is that it's a kind of a void of reason, because CD tilde home is, in that very much noir-y kind of sense of, it's a metaphor being borrowed by the narrator from the situation around to just be used to say something a slightly fancier way. And the thing is that in Unix, commands are case sensitive. CD would not be capitalized. If you do that, you're just going to get that command is not found. And maybe you might be running a newer system that automatically corrects that or says, did you mean CD lowercase? And it brings to the table the question of, well, is this an editing error? Did Thomas Pynchon submit this, correctly phrased? And they said, well, it's a CD, and it's a book about computers, and it's a book about finances, so it's capital CD. Or is it a mistake on Thomas Pynchon's part, as somebody who probably hasn't spent a whole ton of time using the Unix command line, just because there's no real reason he would have. He left Boeing long before Unix existed. Is it, is he just assuming that it's like DOS, where all the commands are uppercase? Or is it Thomas Pynchon screwing with people like me who know better to say, hey, this is capital C, capital D, tilde home? Because, tilde, you wouldn't actually write tilde, you'd use the little squiggly line. It's just like Felix Boingo earlier. Is he some horrible, manipulative cog in a machine that hates Maxine by virtue of not caring at all about her? Or is he just a guy who's making small talk? Or is he something in between? This is just another instance of that kind of inscrutability when you have limited information. And, at some point, all information is limited.
That's a really interesting point. I did not know all that. I'm not, like I said, I'm not very technically well versed in computers and whatnot. So that's always interesting to learn that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at that. I'd be curious if anybody, if any of our listeners have ideas on that as well. So then from there, Maxine and Horst hop into a cab, and there's a lot of what's described as loud traffic in Arabic on the radio, and the cab driver is saying in Inshallah Arabic for whatever. So there's a sort of, interesting kind of ominous tone that this chapter ends on that is going to drive us into the next chapter. Before we move into 29, did y'all have anything else you wanted to talk about in 28?
So the end of the chapter, whenever I listened to it on audiobook, it did kind of strike me the wrong way. Thinking about it, it is a little bit, it could be read as a little bit Islamophobic, a little bit xenophobic. I'm looking at I thought the Pynchon Wiki actually addressed the xenophobia stuff, but I'm looking at it now and it doesn't seem to. I don't know what changed or if something changed or if I'm just have a false memory or something, but it just kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit. That being said, Maxine isn't a perfect person, and it would be a pretty annoying book if Maxine was a perfect person. And, I don't think that she's necessarily racist. I think it is more, and I don't think she's necessarily even Islamophobic. I think it is just kind of xenophobia, where it's just kind of, this person is different than her, is not speaking English. Like I said, at first it was kind of annoying, and I was kind of like, why is Maxine being this way? I read it again, and it didn't strike me as xenophobic as it did at first. So I did want to kind of address that, though, that it does kind of at least initially scan as perhaps problematic in terms of the way that Maxine views this guy.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because of the last sentence in the chapter, or that's how she'll remember it. I think that given the discussion that comes about in the next two chapters about how there was a large increase in the sort of anti-Islamic and really just anti anyone who's not white American, really, sentiment that was really, really pervasive after 9/11. I'm with you in that I was kind of unsettled by that last part, but when I went back and reread it, that last sentence makes me think that this is her, in hindsight, looking back on it and kind of maybe misremembering the actual events or just applying that post 9/11 sort of sentimentality to that specific interaction. And she's kind of forgotten, that this guy is a human being and who knows what he was talking about because she has no context of the conversation before she got in the cab. So I think it maybe is playing with that of, this sort of clouded memory that she has after the attacks, and she's kind of looking back on it in hindsight.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, whether it's an honest account of Maxine's interpretation of events in the moment, or it's her recollection tinging everything. I've laid my stake in the ground that I think I'm fairly firmly convinced at this point in the book that Maxine does harbor quite a bit of anti-Islamic and probably anti-Arab bigotry.
Oh, probably, yeah.
Yeah, and whether it's Maxine or whether, let's be honest, Thomas Pynchon is not a saint. Maybe he doesn't trust Arabs. It could be it's that pervasive throughout the book. But for the sake of conversation about the characters and, literary discussion rather than attacking the character of an author of a book, I really love that ending because simultaneously you have these bookends of the name is Islamic, Muhammad somebody. And I'm struggling to recall or quickly find what the names of the hijackers in 9/11 were. But at least one of them was named Muhammad something.
Yes, definitely was.
Given the way that Thomas Pynchon uses symbols in his writing, I mean, he's definitely putting it there so that you, as a reader, are reminded of that. And you might start thinking about things sinisterly when it might just be a guy driving a taxi listening to a Muslim targeted talk show. But then to have that book ended with the inshallah, as Horst says, is Arabic for whatever. And then to have the correction of the literal phrasing, it gets at kind of the common motif that I've been pointing at throughout this chapter, where translation is a matter of how you use it. You can translate things however you want, and it can make a lot of sense, and it can still be completely wrong. Horst has dealt with people who speak Arabic, I'm sure, more than a few times, hence his reaction of inshallah being Arabic for whatever. Because if you're just listening to it naively, and you don't actually understand the cultural use of, in Islam, you're not allowed to predict things. You're gonna just throw inshallah at the end of a sentence just to be safe, so that you don't come across as like some proud asshole going around predicting events in the future. And that sounds a lot like how people use whatever in terms of grammatical construction and all that. And in the contexts where Horst would be dealing with Arabic speakers, that makes a lot of sense. He's talking to people about like predicting the tides of the markets. It's going to sound like whatever because it's just tagged on to the ends of everything. But, it has a deeper, more accurate meaning.
Yeah, and it's definitely true of any language. If you're unfamiliar with the idioms of that culture and that language, then attempting to translate something literally can be disastrous at times.
Yeah, building off Will's point a little bit, this is something that probably a lot of our listeners already know, but inshallah does, like Will said, it comes up a lot when people are speaking Arabic. I mean, my mom lived in the Middle East for a few years, and she started saying inshallah a good amount, I think, just because, that's just, she'd be like, I think she'd be like to her friends, like, should we go get coffee or something? They'd be like, yes, inshallah, like, yes, if God wills it, basically. It like people in the Middle East say it probably a lot more than Americans or Christians say God, if God wills it or God willing. It's almost like Will was saying, like almost at the end of like a lot of sentences, almost every sentence, and with some people.
So chapter 29, we open with Horst and the boys and maybe Maxine. I don't think it specifically says that she's watching the game with them, but they are watching a football game, the Jets and the Colts. Based on the Pynchon wiki, the description of the game and the point spread is pretty accurate. I think there was a mention that the point spread was slightly different, and that makes a big difference. I know nothing about betting, so I don't know. There's some inclusion of the accuracy of the final play that is mentioned, the fumble return. I love these little details, these little historical things that are seemingly irrelevant, but can really lend to really placing the story as far as the time that it occurs. So yeah, they are watching this game. They end up going after the game to go get pizza. And when they get home, there is a mention of United and American Airlines stock being short sold. For anyone unfamiliar with this, I actually used to work in the investments area for a little while. So short selling, when you're buying stocks, there's essentially two sides of the fence you can be on. You can buy a stock in the hope that you will see an increase in the value of that stock and you'll make money as a result of that. You can also short sell it, or what's called placing a put on that, where you're betting against the company. Essentially, you're betting that the company is going to fail or that something will drag the price down, in which case you benefit and you end up making money on that downfall of the price. Short selling is not it's a very risky thing to do, for one, because there is a lot of room for lost funds in that. But more than that, it's really not something that gets done at a high rate. So basically, from what I was reading about it specifically, there's usually a 1-to-1 ratio between regular purchasing of stocks and short selling stocks. This particular incident, which absolutely did happen, that ratio was 12-to-1. So someone who has not at this point been identified, and I say this point being 2024, made several puts on United and American Airlines stocks in the days leading up to 9/11. Not necessarily the day before. There were some done on the day before, but they were also taking place a couple of days prior to the actual attack. Whoever it was that did this essentially left $5 million unclaimed on the Chicago exchange. So the reason for doing this is completely unknown. Whether or not whoever this was, whether it was an individual or a group of individuals, they left that money untouched. Probably because they didn't, they didn't want to have any kind of scrutiny. It really raises a lot of red flags and a lot of conspiratorial bells, and rightly so. I'm not one that usually gets caught up in conspiracy theories, but this is pretty weird. Snopes, when I went on their website, they marked it as false, but they were using their source for claiming it untrue was the 9/11 Commission. So take that as you will. I don't know that I buy into the idea that they wouldn't know who this person or people were, specifically because in order to buy and sell and place these kind of trades on stocks, you have to have an account of some sort. So it wouldn't be hard to trace that kind of thing. I'm sure there's a reason that whoever was responsible has not been identified. What that reason is, I don't know. But the long and short of it is that this absolutely happened, and it's very, very strange that someone would have done that large of a short sell on those two specific airlines and no others in the days before 9/11.
Yeah, I actually didn't realize that the money was unclaimed and stuff. And this is kind of more general 9/11 stuff than it is about the book necessarily, but the book does mention this. We do know at this point that the Saudi royal family funded the 9/11 hijackers. I guess the money, like you said, was unclaimed, but I don't necessarily know how to put this correctly. But if I were gonna do that terrorist attack, then why not make some money off of it if I'm the Saudi royal family? That's kind of the obvious person behind the puts, people behind the puts, in my mind. But that's rampant speculation that maybe a bit xenophobic, I guess, or something. But yeah, that's kind of my personal theory about it. Like if you're gonna hijack some planes, why not make some money off of it? I guess is the summary of what I'm saying.
It's a wild thing that happened, and I can't wrap my head around it.
Yeah, it's way too much for it to be random.
Yeah, it totally could be random, but like looking at the numbers, people don't just randomly place puts on things, and
No.
to some extent they do literally, but that randomness is generally pretty consistent, and it's just one of those things where whether or not they were the actual funds were unclaimed to the end, it is one of those things that it is suspect for a reason. And my entire life, I was a little too young for 9/11 to be something that I remember, but my entire life, I've heard about all of these conspiracy theories and thought, well, a lot of this makes some sense. A lot of it doesn't make any sense to, try to suppose what could be the motivations.
Mhm.
But that's for me, not necessarily the smoking gun. I'm not a 9/11 truther per se. But if there is a smoking gun, that's one of them
Yeah.
in my mind. Because you don't just do that. You don't just throw money away
No.
specifically on specific airlines if you think that it's anything except for like some kind of insider trading. And maybe it is other insider trading and something else was going to happen that day. It could be a coincidence.
It could be. I think the likelihood of that is astronomical. The unlikelihood of that, rather. Yeah, I mean, like you said, placing a put is a highly risky endeavor. Like you really aren't going to do that unless you have really good reason to suspect that whatever company it is you're placing that put on is going to fail for some reason. And not just a little bit, because you're not really typically going to make a lot on the stock going down a little bit over a period of time. I think it's been years since I've done the investing stuff. I think there's like a time frame on it that they're only open for like 30 days or something like that. I could be wrong on that. If I am, feel free to correct me. But either way, like, yeah, you're not going to place that large of a put on those two specific companies without some kind of foreknowledge, or at least a very strong inkling that something significant is going to happen to drive the prices down. That being said, we'll move off of that. And I do think we should clarify, just to put it out there, as Will already said, we are not 9/11 truthers. I don't want to turn this show into that for any reason whatsoever. This is just a very interesting thing that occurred that has a lot of significance, but we're not going to speculate too much on it. We're definitely not going to say concretely that anything specifically happened with it. So that's that.
Just before we move on, though, I did want to say, in line with our insistence that we are not sitting around, we are not a threat to the American government. We are not patriots. We are all proud Americans. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the specific opening of this chapter with the false statistics from the sports game, as has become kind of a meme at this point in online Pynchon communities, but in case anyone's unaware, there's the scene in the opening of Gravity's Rainbow where Pirate Apprentice sees a rainbow in the sky, and people have gone back and done the math, and it's like, hey, meteorologically, that actually would work. That would have actually happened. Thomas Pynchon is somebody who checks the record books. He's not somebody who accidentally, gets the number wrong when it's something as clear as the odds being a 2-point versus a 1.5 point spread. That's not a mistake. It might not going to do any numerology here, but I do think that that's kind of an indication that this is not meant to be a book that's attacking necessarily the Bush administration or attacking Wall Street as in on 9/11 in any way in particular, but more of a signifier that while those criticisms might be valid and might be in the book, this book is not a conspiracy theory about taking down the US government. And maybe it's just covering his ass. And maybe it's more significant in terms of like saying, hey, this is not the real world. This is a slightly different universe. But I think that those things line up fairly significantly. So in this book, it could be insider trading. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Thomas Pynchon is sitting around saying it was insider trading. The
Yeah.
Saudi government or Wall Street was in on it from the beginning.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that these books sort of in a way take place in an alternate sort of America or world, if you will. So the use of these kind of historical events, I think, is significant in placing the reader and the events at a specific time. But I think it's little things like that, like you're talking about, the little tweaks and changes that are there to remind us that this is a work of fiction at the end of the day. Yes, there are historical elements that absolutely happened and they are in here, but this is a work of fiction, not a manifesto of any sort or any kind of proclamation of being nonfiction or anything like that. So yeah, good point. So we move on from that. Verva calls Maxine. She's really upset, talking about random numbers becoming non-random. Maxine mentions that Horst and his friend Jake Pimento, a name I just adore. I don't know what it is about it. It's a hilarious name. They're staying together at Jake's apartment, and they're supposed to go to work the next day at the World Trade Center. There's a mention of Homer Simpson in a film noir, or what is more aptly referred to as a film genre, which killed me, called DOH or Doe, what Homer says all the time, but is also a wonderful play on the, there's a 1950 film noir called DOA. If you haven't watched it, one of the best film noirs, I think, that has ever been made. So go watch it if you haven't, because it's fantastic. So Verva and Fiona come over and they stay with Maxine and the boys. Other than those specific events, there's not much that goes on in that early part of the chapter. But then the next day is 9/11. Maxine drops the kids off at Kugelblitz and is informed of the first plane hitting the tower by a vendor, I think at a newspaper store or just a little bodega kind of thing. This is essentially what it was for those of us who were that were there when it happened. Not there necessarily, but when it happened, we saw it on the news, and it just seemed like an errant plane happened to hit the first tower, and it was everyone is obviously panicking, and there was cause for concern. But at that moment, until the second plane hit, it was just everyone thought, well, this was just a horrible accident, and I'm sure we'll figure out what happened and try to go from there. And then the second plane hits, and that's the moment that everything kind of stopped for so many people. And I can, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, I can remember being in high school in my science class, actually, when the teacher was informed of it, and I don't recall that we had any way of accessing like live TV at the time. I was in a very small town in Texas. So we put it on the radio and we were listening to it, and it was a very surreal feeling to know that kind of thing was happening and not know what was going to come next. So the description that he gives after that second plane hit the second tower is incredibly well written. It really captures a sense of confusion and fear and the unknown that was really gripping the entire country at that time. Do y'all have anything you want to comment on specifically with this particular section?
Like you were kind of getting at, it was a very confusing day. I think I remember asking my mom or my dad, did we know anyone who would have been affected? Because I was living in upstate New York at that time, so it wasn't out of the question that somebody was related to somebody we knew or something. I think there's a kid on my football team whose uncle passed away in the attack. It was it's a very confusing day. I was in elementary school still. I was in 6th grade. I didn't find out about the attacks until I was walking home, and the kids from the middle school next to the elementary school were telling us about it. And then I got home and we watched TV the rest of the day. It is just kind of, it is very accurate that people were glued to the television that day. That's what my family was. That's pretty much everyone else I knew was just kind of at home watching the TV, trying to figure out what was going on. A lot of it rings very true. Even the questions the boys ask and stuff like that. So
Yeah, I think that part particularly was hard to imagine, the boys knowing that their dad was supposed to go to work there, and then no one's able to get in touch with him, and everyone who's calling is not Horst, and Maxine and the boys just want to hear, if not from him, from someone who knows that he's okay, or what's going on with him. So that's just adding to the stress and the confusion of the whole situation. There's a really interesting part in here where they're watching the events on the news, and Otis says, it said on the news that they're Saudi Arabians. Otis tells her, maybe we're at war with Saudi Arabia. Can't be, Ziggy points out. We need all that oil. This is a really interesting conversation that happens here, because that is exactly how kind of the order of events started to unfold. The initial, for lack of a better term, finger pointing was at Saudi Arabia. And then over time, that narrative in the media, at least, and from the government, started to shift and would focus more on Iraq and Afghanistan to justify what became the war on terror. And the idea that the Saudis were involved in any way sort of got pushed to the background, or at least they tried to. As Luke mentioned earlier, it ended up coming to light that the Saudi royal family were funding the people responsible for the attack. So it's interesting to see how that narrative, over not a very long period of time, went from what was actually the case to what the story needed to be, or at least what this, the people that are in charge of reporting the stories wanted to have it be. So that was a really kind of interesting thing, and I had forgotten initially that the initial blame rested in the correct place, but then kind of moved away from that.
I really do love the way that Ziggy and Otis are written in this section.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like, Luke, you would have been about their age when this happened, and so you could probably speak more accurately to it in terms of like the psychological experience. But like you said, you didn't know about it until after the day was over. And I'm much younger, and I was at home with my mother, and I remember nothing in particular, but what I do remember in hindsight was the sense that a tornado was coming, because I was at the time living in a place where tornadoes would occasionally touch down. And I remember my family just sounding like, well, there's a tornado. Maybe it's not going to hit anybody, but maybe we're all going to die. And that just seems like that's the experience of most children during that day, was that sense of anticipation that never really let up, as the next couple chapters are going to go into.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt that too. In being in high school, it kind of felt like what happened there was sort of the beginning of something that was going to be much bigger. Not to downplay the significance of that event itself, but it certainly, because we had never seen anything like that in our lifetimes, and so I think there's a sort of natural inclination to think that that is just sort of the start of whatever is coming on from there, and there were certainly reports of that potentially being the case, and the rumors definitely picked up a lot that there was that was just a prelude to something bigger happening, and this and that and the other. So yeah, it really kept that tension redlining for a long time.
The one thing I wanted to say is the whole are we going to war thing? Are we at war? There's definitely a thing that day, especially with kids. I remember I think I had a friend at the time who I think said that it was, blamed the Iraq government. Said it was, I think I distinctly remember that, like somebody would blame the Iraqis on it because CNN or some news channel had shown people in Iraq celebrating the 9/11 attacks supposedly and stuff like that. There was the prelude to the war on terror, and the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. It already kind of started that day. In terms of, it did seem like we were at war. We would soon be going to war. So that does, which also kind of plays into the conversation with March a little bit too.
Yeah. So on that note, yeah, Maxine, the next call she gets is from March Kelleher, and she compares the attacks to the Reichstag fire. Do either of you have any knowledge on that you want to talk about? All I have is from what was on the Pynchon wiki. I didn't really know much about it beforehand, but
I'm not super familiar with it. I haven't looked at what the Pynchon wiki says about it, but my knowledge of it is basically that it was an organized attempt to make it look like the German government was under attack, and therefore they needed to shore up their security, which then led to the book burnings and the various like actual assassinations that led up to the Third Reich being what it was.
Yeah, and I actually could be wrong about this. I'm not 100% about this, but the Reichstag, I believe, was the building that the German Congress or their parliament was housed in, and I think
I
that
think that's right.
yeah, and I think that the German parliament was basically dissolved after that for whatever reason. So it is kind of like the death of German democracy. And then I believe in the early 1930s, correct?
Yeah,
Where it
1933.
it kind of marks the end of like I said, German democracy, and the end of and the beginning of Hitler basically being an all powerful dictator with nobody there to kind of check his power.
Yeah, it literally happened a month after he was sworn in as chancellor, and so yeah, essentially it was a pretext for them to establish their grip and their dominance on Germany. So I'll read this conversation between March and Maxine, because I think this is a really crucial part of this chapter. As if by ESP, the phone rings and it's March Kelleher. It's the Reichstag fire. She greets Maxine. The what? Those fucking Nazis in Washington needed a pretext for a coup. Now they've got it. This country's headed up Schitt's Creek, and it isn't Rugriders we should be worried about. It's Bush and the gang. Maxine isn't so sure. It seems like none of them know what they're doing right now. Just caught by surprise, more like Pearl Harbor. That's what they want you to believe. And who says Pearl Harbor wasn't a setup? They're actually discussing this? Forget doing it to your own people. Why would anybody do this to their own economy? You never heard of you've got to spend money to make money? Tithing back to the dark gods of capitalism. Then something occurs to Maxine. March, that DVD of Regs, the Stinger missile. I know, we got snookered. March is essentially laying the idea out there that this is something that the government was complicit in, and that they were using it as a means to essentially, tighten their grip on the country as a whole, and to exert their power and really kind of plant their flag, so to speak, in the government and the foundation for what was to come. It's a really interesting reading this in 2024. And I think if we look back to Vineland, which, having just done that book, I think it really strikes truer when we get to something like this, because if you can trace a lot of this back to the beginning of the Reagan administration and even the Nixon administration, and how they used a lot of events, not necessarily anything like this, but they were using whatever opportunities came along to kind of strengthen their chokehold on the government, and to ensure that the policies and the laws that they wanted to get passed could get pushed through by instilling fear and playing on the fear in people's minds. And whether or not anyone wants to believe any level of complicity that the government had, I don't want to speculate on that in any way, shape, or form, really. You could absolutely walk out how they could take an event like this, whether or not they had any hand in doing it, or any foreknowledge of it happening, and standing back and saying whatever. You can absolutely trace their taking of this event and using it as a means to further their agenda in the years to come, in the decades to come. Going from the war on terror that George Bush Jr. started in I can't remember, it was 2002, 2001, that led to years-long conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and destabilized a lot of the Middle East more than it already was. That led to the creation of ISIS, and strength, and the ongoing disputes with Al Qaeda. That event specifically kind of started a new sort of rippling effect that has reverberated and allowed the powers that be to kind of continue to tighten their grip on a lot of what is going on in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, there's a few different things I wanted to kind of address with that. Where have y'all seen the movie Vice?
I've not.
The Dick Cheney
I have not.
biopic?
No. That's the one with Christian Bale, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it does cover the fact that I guess, and that I think I might have even read about this in the newspaper at the time, and I can't remember if it was, but I think it was because 9/11 was pretty early in the Bush presidency, so I imagine it was
Mhm.
afterwards. But during the Bush presidency, the Justice Department, or like there was a legal precedent set that the president can do like basically whatever he wants with like impunity, basically, which is still coming up today in terms of legal stuff that's going on right now that I don't really want to get super into. But that like that legal precedent is a part of the like like the legal system of America now, like where like a judge ruled that or something. I don't necessarily understand the intricacies of it, but that was a thing at that time. And then like the Patriot Acts were a direct response to 9/11, and those greatly expanded the American government's ability to surveil its own citizens, which is something that somebody like Thomas Pynchon would probably think was a very big deal. And I do think it was. I would agree with him in that, and I obviously don't know if he does think that, but I have to imagine he does. And the Patriot Acts were a pretty big deal. And yeah, and I mean, even the war in Iraq, while like I said, like you were saying, like I'm not a truther, we're not truthers. But the war in Iraq, like that was completely manufactured. Like they had nothing to do with 9/11 at all. And the whole like WMD thing, weapons of mass destruction excuse was turned out to be a completely false, made up excuse. So 9/11 definitely directly led to the Patriot Acts. It seems to have directly led to the war in Iraq, which was which we were led into under false. The American people were led into under false pretenses. Led to the war in Afghanistan, which went on for like 20 years. Led to the legal precedent being set that the president can act with impunity, basically. Life in America and changed after 9/11, and obviously was going to, but the ways it changed, definitely kind of benefited. I don't want to use the word fascist, but like kind of it's weirdly to like expanding your ability to surveil your citizens. It's kind of definitely a facet of totalitarianism and stuff. Like I don't know. I
Yeah.
think y'all see what I'm getting at.
Yeah. No, I'm not disagreeing with that.
Yeah, and just to drive the point that you're making home, Luke, the Patriot Act is a large enough act of Congress that every single section of it has its own Wikipedia page, and each of those pages, I believe, has further subpages. And like again, just Wikipedia, I feel like it's a fairly neutral thing to cite in these kinds of conversations. Here are the three main provisions via Wikipedia. Expanded surveillance abilities of law enforcement, including by wiretapping domestic and international phones. Easier interagency communication to allow federal agencies to more effectively use all available resources in counterterrorism efforts, and increased penalties for terrorism crimes and an expanded list of activities which would qualify for terrorism charges. So I mentioned earlier that the puts being made against United Airlines and whichever the other one was, because this is
American.
Thank you very much. This is the other smoking gun I kind of vaguely alluded to. A month after 9/11 attacks, the House of Representatives was introduced to this act that is hundreds of pages long. And a day later, they voted to pass it. And a day after that, the Senate voted to pass it with almost unanimous support in the Senate and vast majority support in the House of Representatives. This is ignoring whether it could have been a situation where, for years, the intelligence community and various interested parties had been workshopping these things, and so it was all within the parties. They'd all discussed it, and everyone had already made their decisions. And then they introduced the act so that there would just be the one bill to sign because it looks good for news purposes. It's a kind of a gross misuse of the responsibilities of Congress to pass those kinds of laws so quickly, because as has been very tediously stated by many people over the last 23 years, it would take months for anybody to read the full Patriot Act. And sure, people have aides. And sure, like I said, people were probably workshopping specific aspects of the Patriot Act for years. But that's an insane amount of legislation to put into effect in 3 days.
Yeah.
From the 23rd of October 2001 to the 26th is all it took for that. I mean, it's seriously, it's like literally, I think, thousands of pages when printed in the typical way that bills are printed. It's an insane amount of legislation to pass in that period of time, ignoring any of the actual, like, well, should we pass any of these specific details? That's a smoking gun, even if it's not, even if it is just a coincidence, even if it was like, well, we have these bills that we've been putting together to deal with the KKK, and hey, we can say they're for terrorism. In that best case scenario, that's insane.
Yeah, and to tie it all back around into Pynchon's work in general, we've talked before in previous episodes on the other books that we've covered, and even earlier in this episode, we've talked about how his books are centered on moments of history in which there is a vast and major cultural and economic, governmental, massive change, and this from here throughout the rest of this book, but especially in this from here to this chapter and then into the next chapter, is where he's laying out exactly how everything is changing now and how quickly it's all changing. And Will put it perfectly. Like, if you understand historically how long it takes for bills to move through Congress and the House of Representatives, for it to have gone through, the Patriot Act to have gone through that quickly is astonishing. And I mean, this is essentially, this is where the shift is occurring. The attack itself is obviously a huge moment in history, but everything that happens from here on out is that cultural shift, that zeitgeist change, that change in the political balance of power. This is that moment where we're going to see how all this plays out.
Well, also, I mean, they're called the Patriot Acts, which implies that if you don't like them, then you're not patriotic.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is obnoxious. One other thing that I wanted to bring up is, like, whenever Bush got into office, I don't, as far as I remember, we weren't actively involved in any conflicts around the world. But, Dick Cheney was Bush's vice president. Dick Cheney, I want to say, was the former CEO of the main military contractor that we used I forget the name of it. But he was the former CEO of the main military contractor that we used in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he was still he owned some large percentage of that company as well, still, even when he was vice president. Which, if you ever want to, that's a pretty big incentive for you to go to war if you own, say, 30% of a company that the whole point of it is to, serve a government while it's at war.
Would have been Halliburton and Dresser Industries.
Halliburton, I think, is the one. Yeah.
So getting back into the story itself, so Maxine then receives a call from Windust. They have a very kind of tense and quick conversation. Maxine clearly doesn't have time for his horse shit, and obviously is dealing with everything going on and trying to figure out where Horst is. And Windust's call, I think, is kind of the last thing she needs, but it does lead to her having a rather interesting dream. And I'm curious if y'all had any interpretation of what this dream is. We've mentioned before, we've had several kind of dream passages throughout this book, and we've had some really interesting analysis on those dreams. Did y'all have anything with this particular dream that you wanted to go over?
I don't. I do find it interesting to think about in a really well-written dream sequence, but I have trouble unpacking it.
Yeah, outside of kind of broad, comparisons to allegories that Pynchon has made in previous books, like, the famous enclosing of the pens in opening of Against the Day. It reminds me a little bit of kind of Maxine realizing that she's in the same place as her little teeny dream sequence during her rendezvous with Windust, where she saw Lester popping out, and realizing that, she, just like he, was dead and a spirit looking for, at least acknowledgement. This is now a state that many, many people are in, even those left on Earth.
Yeah, that's about online with what I was able to pull from it. I'm curious. I meant to ask Kate if she had any specifics on it, because I think tends to be the one that really kind of clocks these dream sequences and is able to pull something really interesting out of them. But she didn't include anything in the notes about it. So as Luke said, this is a really beautifully written passage in which she is a mouse kind of running through a sort of maze. And if anybody listening has any thoughts on this particular section, because I'm sure there's something there that I just, we might have missed, well, write us and let us know. I would love to hear people's interpretation of that.
Just the part of it that really grabs onto me, in the sense that I can't really connect it to anything in particular, is the kind of similarities in this dream sequence to the allegory told near the end of Vineland about the afterlife, and
Oh yeah.
It at the end, where it's mentioned each of them will be released, and this can only be analogous to death and afterlife. As we all kind of talked about during that episode of Vineland, it's a tricky thing to grasp.
Yeah.
What exactly he's getting at, and this does not elucidate it.
Maxine the next day finds out that Horst is okay. He had fallen asleep at Jake's apartment after watching a football game, and they just decided not to go into work that day. And so as a result, he managed to avoid the catastrophe that happened there. We then get a little bit of a discussion where Horst it's kind of an interesting moment of him really opening up and really being vulnerable when he talks about, initially he's talking about this person that he used to know who would talk about his sort of prescience for market behavior, and how he could, he specifically mentions like shorting companies like Amazon to make money on those, and sort of how he had this uncanny sort of ability to kind of know when to do that, but he can't really necessarily say that he could predict something as major as what happened. And Maxine kind of pushes him on it and mentions, if they wonders if they were just different forms of the same thing, which he says is way too anti-capitalist for him. And then he talks about, as I mentioned, this kind of moment of vulnerability where he talks about how he sees Maxine saw him. You always had me figured for some kind of idiot savant. You were the one with the street smarts, the wised up practical one, and I was just some stiff with a gift who didn't deserve to be so lucky. First time he said this to her in person, though it's a pitch he made more than once to an imaginary ex-wife, alone at night in hotel rooms in the U.S. and abroad, where sometimes the television speaks in languages he doesn't know any more of than he needs to get around. The room service always brings him somebody else's food, which he has learned to go along with, in a spirit of adventurous curiosity, reminding himself that he would otherwise never have experienced, say, blackened alligator casserole with fried pickles or sheep's eyeballs pizza. Daytime business for him is duck soup, which they also brought him once for breakfast, and kwai. I'm probably mispronouncing that. With no connection, he can clearly see to the other, the backstreets of the day, the 3 a.m. retranslations appropriate to fear of unwelcome dreams, the unreadable vistas of city windows, of city shadow out the windows, poisonous blue masses he doesn't want to see but keeps drawing back the drapes a little to blink through for as long as he has to, as if something is happening out there he mustn't miss. I'm curious about y'all's thoughts on this, because this is a really, we're getting a very sort of intimate view of Horst and how he sees himself, and he's not necessarily saying all this to Maxine, but we as a reader are understanding this, given also the history that we have with him, and the allusions to him being an abusive spouse. How do y'all feel about this? Does this in any way kind of change your perspective on him, or does it just present another side of him, but doesn't really, it doesn't to me rationalize his behavior, but it's an interesting side of him to see and capture that part of him that we haven't really seen before.
It does show a level of introspection that I don't think we've seen from Horst before. And perhaps, I mean, it does kind of perhaps show the fact that he regrets the divorce and regrets some of the things that happened with him and Maxine, and that he's been sitting around, thinking about how good he used to have it, and how, she possesses qualities that he doesn't have, and how they complement each other. Yeah, I did like the fact that it does endear me to Horst, who before this is just kind of he's not, I had trouble kind of taking him seriously. He's not the most fleshed out character in general in this book. He's not flat. I wouldn't say he's a flat character either.
No, he's presented as kind of a goofball, though.
Yeah, he's not presented as a super serious person, and so this does kind of come out of left field a little bit. But yeah, like I said, it does endear me to him, and it does show a level of a depth of thought that we don't get beforehand. We didn't get until this.
Yeah, in terms of Horst's character, I more or less agree with what y'all have said. It strikes me as really, I mean, this is one of the only moments in the book where we firmly view things from outside of Maxine's perspective for longer than a sentence or two.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to see Horst trying to grapple with this weird power that he seems to have, which in this case saved his life, but in the past has made him a lot of money.
Yeah, it's a really interesting portrayal of him, and yeah, I definitely agree with y'all that it humanizes him, but it definitely doesn't atone for what he has done in the past. But it's definitely a interesting window into him as a character. So after that, the next day, Maxine and Horst take the boys to school. This is a really short little section in this chapter that really is only 2 paragraphs, but it really does an excellent job of capturing the day after of sort of everyone's collective days and the kind of way in which they're going around and sort of there's an increased sense of needing to protect everybody and to not want to let go of the people that are close to you and not want to separate from them. Maxine, at the opening of the book, she, the kids are running in front of her and she has no problem just, taking them to school and leaving them outside in the front. But, here we are where, no one wants to make that separation for fear of what comes next. And it's, a very touching section of the book. And the last sentence especially really struck me. A viewing population brought back to its default state, dumbstruck, undefended, scared shitless. That, in a few words, Pynchon has summarized how pretty much all of us felt in the day after that, and especially I would imagine the people who lived in New York City. It's just a stunning, well-written passage. From there, we get another scene with March, in which she is just really, really fired up about everything that's going on, which, knowing March, that is not surprising. She goes on to kind of, go back to the Reichstag fire example that she brought up earlier, kind of is going over with Maxine, what she thinks specifically is happening here and the context of the attacks and how that's going to reverberate out going forward. About a week later, they end up meeting for breakfast. They talk about the DVD that Maxine had received from Reg and talk about specifically, they kind of go over what they think was being shown on there. And does somebody want to read the section in which they kind of go over what was supposed to, or what they at least think was going to be happening?
Yeah, I can read it. But March, relentlessly on the case, brings up Reg's DVD. Suppose there was a Stinger crew deployed and waiting for orders to shoot down the first 767, the one that went on to hit the North Tower. Maybe there was another team stationed over in Jersey to pick up the second one, which would have been circling around and coming up from southwest. Why? Anti-compassion insurance. Somebody doesn't trust the hijackers to go through with it. These are Western minds, uncomfortable with any idea of suicide in the service of a faith. so they threaten to shoot the hijackers down in case they chicken out at the last minute. And if the hijackers do change their minds, what if the Stinger team do the same and don't shoot the plane down? Then that would explain the backup sniper on the other roof, who the Stinger people know is there, keeping them in his sights till their part of the mission is over, which is as soon as the guy with the phone gets the word the plane's committed. Then everybody cleans up and clears out. It's full daylight by then, but not that much risk of being seen because all the attention is focused downtown. Help, 2 Byzantine, make it stop. Trying, but is Bush answering my calls?
So this we saw earlier all of that play out in as Maxine watched that DVD for the first time, and now looking back on it with the hindsight of what's happened, this is a really interesting scene, I think, because you have the extreme that March is going on, and I can get where she's coming from with a lot of what she's talking about. Especially with where she says, no matter how the official narrative of this turns out, it seemed to Heidi, these are places that we should be looking, not in newspapers or television, but the margins, graffiti, uncontrolled utterances, bad dreamers who sleep in public and scream in their sleep. March definitely has a very concrete idea in her mind of what is going on in this. It's hard not to see it from that perspective. But I think at the same time, there could be alternate explanations for what's going on. But it's hard for, as a reader at least, it's hard for me to separate that. If we're looking at everything that March has just kind of laid out. So I'm curious, do you see this as, this is March right in surmising what's going on here, or is this just she's seizing the opportunity and taking something that was more than likely just something else that can overlap with what's going on now and kind of feed that narrative that she's created?
Well, I think the last episode kind of I went into a lot of my thoughts on the actual the metaphysical reality of the Stinger crew.
Mm-hmm.
But I really feel like the opening of this little section of the chapter is kind of why I have that interpretation. Where on her weblog, March Kelleher has wasted no time shifting into what she calls her old lefty tirade mode. This could be her ascertaining actually what was going on. But as was referenced earlier, she says we were snookered. And I'm not a pool guy, but my understanding is that there is the actual game of snooker. But when something has been snookered, it's using the ball that you just hit in order to score one of your own balls, is my understanding. Yeah. And I kind of see this as March frantically trying to assemble a way that she wasn't part of the problem in some sense. That this is March saying, hey, I wasn't snookered, or if I was just part of such a big plan that there was nothing I could have done about it. These guys were part of 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
These guys were part of all of this, and maybe they were. I think her interpretation of events is as reasonable as any other in this section. But at the same time, it seems a lot more like an ego self-defense kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to view that. From there, we go into Horst again talking about bringing up the United and American Airlines put options, and also mentioning that there were, as he put it, lopsided put-to-call ratios for Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and a couple others like them, all tenants of the Trade Center. I could not find any actual instance of this, unlike with the United Airlines and American Airlines, where that is a documented thing that happened. I couldn't find any kind of article that was mentioning this or anything where those companies in particular were mentioned as having been short sold. I don't know if there's a way to go back and look into that, into the trading records. I'm sure there is. But this could just be Pynchon kind of, heightening up that, there was some kind of powers that be behind the scenes that knew what was going on and were trying to capitalize on it, as Luke mentioned earlier. If you can capitalize and make money on a act of terrorism, take advantage of it, I guess, if you have the opportunity. The people who are willing to do that kind of evil are, not going to really think about the consequences or the impact that it has on people. Maxine ends up going to her parents' house, where Brooke and Avi are, and this leads to a very tense conversation between her and Brooke about the way that the media is portraying this. what are y'all's thoughts on the conversation that goes on between the two of them?
There are some really interesting kind of smaller sections in it. One part that stands out to me is, whose side are you on? Are you an American, or what are you?
Yes.
I know that this scene has been memed to death, but I did recently watch the movie Civil War by Alex Garland. A similar line is said in that. Anyways, I mean, then there's the mention of the 4360.0 kilohertz thing, which is also an interesting little thing where that does kind of bring to mind that Maxine is called anti-Semitic for bringing that up, and I think by Avi, and then I think her sister Brooke kind of seems to agree with Avi. This does come up in Inherent Vice as well, where I forget the guy's name, but I'm actually forgetting all the names in that book for some reason, except for Doc. But Doc's love interest, her love interest, the guy with the entire plot centers around, like he's the real estate mogul guy. I'm
Mickey
completely blanking.
Wolfman.
I think it's Mickey Wolfman. Yeah, he's portrayed as Jewish, but then he hangs out with Nazis. This kind of anti-Semitism among Jews themselves does seem to kind of be a thing that Pynchon, a theme that Pynchon plays with in his final two novels. I don't necessarily agree that Maxine is being anti-Semitic. I think you can definitely interpret it that way.
No, and I'm glad you brought up that line about, are you an American or what are you? Because I think that's emblematic of at the time of the sort of knee jerk reactions that people would have if you in any way questioned the narrative that was coming out of how things transpired, or if you in the years following, if you spoke out in protest against the war on terror, or anything like that, would cause these sort of like reactionary events of questioning your patriotism or your loyalty to the country, which is absurd, but it's exactly playing into the hands of the powers that be, and that this is exactly what they wanted, was to instill this sense of, if you don't buy into the narrative that we're giving you, then you're the enemy or you're supporting the enemy. And that's kind of morphed into its own twisted and distorted thing in recent years. But it really evolved out of that and has extrapolated itself into something almost completely new from there. And I don't really want to get into the weeds about that, but yeah, that specific line I think was something that we heard a lot of.
Yeah, I don't see it as much more than kind of what one would expect people in their situation to kind of respond with. Because, I mean, yeah, it's much easier to think, yep, this was an attack on the United States government by people who hate us and want us dead because we're so free. However, whatever shade of gray you want to throw in there, it's much easier to believe that kind of black and white narrative where you are the good guys who have been attacked for no reason, and suddenly this person who you thought was your sister, you thought, sure, you bickered, but come on, you can't seriously think that this is anything but some horrible event being taken against us because we're the good guys and they're the bad guys.
Mm-hmm. They hate freedom. That was the thing that was always said, is they hate freedom.
Yeah, and it's it's easy, especially 20 years later, to sit around and mock that not even archetype, but that kind of thought process. But it's fundamentally is so much easier to accept that kind of black and white view, especially in a time of crisis. Especially when a lot of the theories that would be coming around then and still spill out to this day, blame Israel or blame the Jews as a force. Mm-hmm. So much of it would have been like something that Brooke has a good reason to respond like this to. And that's not to say that she's in the right, but it is also just a deeply human response. And I think that in some ways this is meant to be viewed as kind of like the blackest of black comic turn on the Felix Boingo conversation, where you're like, well, do they actually know something? Yeah. Especially once you get to the moment where, oh, what's the latest on 4360 kilohertz? Or oops, do I mean megahertz? Arab propaganda, anti-Semitic filth. Who told you about this frequency? Like, maybe not you're supposed to, but I think it's totally written to be like, well, Why are you asking? Who told you about this frequency? But at the same time, it could just be an Israeli guy who has heard all of this stuff before, who's been through all this. He's in cybersecurity. He knows about these number stations. He knows that whatever it is, it's something effectively just like in cahoots with the rest of the world. And if Maxine is bringing this up now, why is she doing this except to jab at him? And that's what she's doing, because Maxine's response to all these things is to lash out and to be snide and an asshole to everyone around her. But that, it's just this deep web of like scar tissue that so many Jewish people develop and so many Israeli people develop, whether they're, Jewish Israelis or Arab or whatever. It's just a really dark moment where you can totally, if you inhabit any of their perspectives, it all makes sense. It's all very human and it's all terrible.
Yeah. No, it absolutely. You're absolutely right. Like it is one of the most, I think, human conversations in this book, and in that it's, very unflinchingly, talking about this very serious thing and showing really, both sides of this situation, and not really saying that either is right or wrong strictly. But then also in the middle of it, Ernie tries to jump in and diffuse things as it's described, diffuse things with geezer nostalgia, and trying to compare it to how the media coverage of JFK was kind of similar. But he also has a really interesting line in here where, after he says that the same thing happened with JFK, and he's asked if he thought it was an inside job, his response is, the chief argument against conspiracy theories is always that it would take too many people in on it, and somebody's sure to squeal. But look at the U.S. security apparatus. These guys are WASPs, Mormons, skull and bones, secretive by nature, trained, sometimes since birth, never to run off at the mouth. If discipline exists anywhere, it's among them. So of course it's possible. Which that reads to me like another, Pynchon self-insert kind of thing here, where he's, this is, I think, more his point of view on all of this, and that something that he's kind of been saying throughout his work, that as wild as these conspiracy theories can seem, and the idea that it's easy for them to unravel because of the fact that somebody's bound to talk, the fact of the matter is a lot of the people that are in on it are probably pretty well trained in not talking. And the couple of times that there have been slip-ups, Watergate being the obvious one that comes to mind, it immediately gets kind of shut down, and the attempts to distort and warp what happened are swift, and do everything they can to kind of dust everything away and put it into the background. So that was a really interesting thing I thought that Ernie brought up, and just felt very Pynchonian, I thought.
Yeah, as much as in general, I do think that it would take too many people in on it. Well, 9/11 is not one of those situations.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the potential, essentially, insider trading that may or may not have happened. That's a indication of something. But really, who are we talking about that would need to have been in on 9/11 to make it happen if it were an inside job? It seriously is no more than a dozen people.
Yeah.
And a dozen people, especially people from, such a secretive religious background as Mormonism, or people who come from Skull and Bones, that's the kind of secret they can keep. Doesn't mean that it was an inside job, but at the same time, in this case, it really doesn't. It's not relevant.
Yeah. So from there, there's a mention of going back to the kind of discussion that we were having earlier about the perception of the Jewish community and the difficulties that they have to deal with, and especially after 9/11, sort of anti-Semitism that got ramped up again. Avi specifically mentions the video, or not the video, but the mention of Jews dancing on the roof of that van over in Jersey. For those unfamiliar, and weirdly, this came up again, I think, a few years ago. I want to say it was around the time of the 2020 election, maybe a little bit before or after that, but that got brought up again. That whole idea has been debunked. There were, I think it was 5 Israeli men that were arrested. They were driving in a van. They had box cutters on them. So of course that got blown out of proportion because it happened right after 9/11. The reality of the matter is that they worked for a moving company, and hence the need for box cutters. But that specific image of people, of specifically Jewish people, dancing on a van and celebrating 9/11 has really not left the public mindset, which, true to, a lot of what Pynchon does, like highlighting that negative or dark aspect of our culture that really just kind of never goes away. Maxine leaves, and on her way out, Ernie pulls her aside and asks if she was able to find anything on Avi. Does anyone want to read what she mentions at the end of 325, starting with "I did," and you know what?
I did, and you know what? He thinks Avram really is Mossad, all right, on station, tapping his foot to a klezmer beat only he can hear, waiting to be activated. Evil Jewish conspiracy, except you'll notice Abi never talks about what he was doing over in Israel. Neither of them do, any more than what he's doing here now for Hashslingers. The one thing I can guarantee you is it'll be well compensated. Wait and see. He'll give you guys a Mercedes for your anniversary. A Nazi car? Good, so I'll sell it.
So this I thought was a really interesting way to end this chapter, kind of going back to that, again, Maxine and Felix, and Maxine and Gabriel Ice, and whether or not there's any complicity there, it's really hard to say. But one way or another, someone's going to profit from it, from what they're doing. Whether or not Avi is directly involved with anything that Gabriel Ice is doing, or whether he even knows what's going on, or he's just a guy in the background doing whatever job he got called in to do. There's no way of knowing. But as Maxine says, he is going to get paid for doing what he's doing. Do y'all have any thoughts on this ending of this chapter, or anything else in 29 that you want to go over?
From earlier in the chapter, this is not super serious, but I do think it's really funny that Horst, presumably has been asked by Maxine, like, what happened? Why did you not go into work? And, all that stuff. And Horst leads, like, as if it's really important information that Denver won it 31-20. If I were Maxine, I'd be pretty frustrated with Horst that he included the score of the game as part of why he is alive, and also kind of shows how not serious of a person Horst is.
Yeah, for me, the one thing I want to return to in this chapter, kind of not one thing, I guess. So just for some technical background, because I believe we've talked about it before, but just for a refresher, basically, mathematically, you cannot come up with an algorithm that will provide you with random numbers. At the very least, because even if you can create an algorithm that gives you numbers that are as close to random as is conceivable, somebody could figure out your algorithm and therefore be able to predict what the next number is going to be at any given moment. So the way that places like the NSA, or massive companies like Google or Oracle get around those issues is by taking in real world data. One of the most famous is I forget who does this. I think this is the NSA's old way of doing it. They basically had NOAA, the National Oceanographic Institute, the weather service for the USA. Basically, they had their weather stations also have these little computer chips that were taking in the weather information with some random shorts in the connections, so that basically they would then collect that data from NOAA, or via NOAA. I don't think that the oceanographic and weather folks really did anything with it, but they took the data via NOAA, and just funneled it all together and got out essentially random numbers. And at a certain point, I think what happened is they gave up on that because it's just a lot of work, and they shifted over to something else. Cloudflare, a very large cybersecurity-oriented infrastructure company, the way they do it is they have this might have changed, but one of the methods was they had literally just a wall full of lava lamps, just a wall covered in lava lamps. And they had a camera that was constant, like just a webcam, a normal webcam, just taking in constant video. And the way that they would feed random numbers to their cryptographic algorithms for cybersecurity purposes was to literally take in that data and just take a single number from the raw webcam digital footage and use that as a number instead of like a pixel or whatever. And these sorts of like very wide scale randomness generating devices, whether it's wide scale and, across the entire country, any federal government weather station was feeding data back to the NSA to provide them with as close to random information as could be got. Or it's, just a giant wall of lava lamps where you can't actually model how any of those wax globs are going to fall. And then, essentially take the randomness that is taking a video feed and using it as a number. There's this sort of correlation with Horst's gift at just being able to know when to short something or when to buy into something. And I think that if I'm going to try and, from this chapter alone, pull like a single concrete belief about what Thomas Pynchon might be saying about 9/11, it is that whether or not it is something which, whether or not 9/11 was something that can be called a conspiracy, whether or not it was an inside job, whether or not any of this, whether it was individuals who were working with people, or whether it was a top-down operation, whatever, there's always going to be the potential of somebody like Horst, of somebody who just happens to decide, I'm not going to go into work tomorrow. Mm-hmm. There's always going to be the chance that the random number generator just starts outputting consistent numbers for some reason. And, the insider trading might have just been a coincidence, and that's always going to be a possibility. And there is no way, in retrospect, to actually discern those things for certain, at the very least.
That's a really good point.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
So chapter 30, we open with the dichotomy of how the events are portrayed in the news versus how they're portrayed online. There is a lot of conspiracy theories that almost immediately started coming to light, and we were seeing a lot of those disseminate on the early form of the internet, and really and truly continue to this day. I do think it was interesting that the mention that ground zero was a misuse of the term. It was something I didn't really wasn't really fully aware of. And I guess I'd forgotten from my last reading that was actually a Cold War term, specific about the site of a nuclear blast. We also see a very different New York City the day after, where it talks about how the West Side Highway has fallen silent, and that the sort of ambient noise that existed has kind of gone away. I think really, for those who weren't around at this time or were too young to have remembered it, I think maybe the closest situation that we have come to this was the beginning months of COVID, and the sort of abandoned feel that everything had. If you went out and like drove around, there were very few cars out. A lot of businesses, there were no cars in the parking lot. It was a very surreal feeling to be around that, and that's kind of that's essentially what it was like in New York after 9/11. I would imagine, especially in a city as busy as New York is, that would just be even more surreal and just disorienting. There's a mention of the site of the attack, which I thought was a very well written passage. The atrocity site, which one would have expected to become sacred or at least inspire a little respect, swiftly becomes occasion instead for open-ended sagas of wheeling and dealing, bickering and bad-mouthing over its future as real estate, all dutifully celebrated as news in the newspaper of record. That's something I think kind of doesn't really get discussed enough, or isn't remembered enough, that in the days and months and even the years after the attacks, that the the use of the site for photo ops and for this kind of posturing and as he mentions the business deals that were happening in the aftermath of all this is disgusting, but it was absolutely was happening. We're seeing more and more of the as Pynchon refers to it, the ethnic toxicities that are firing up in the aftermath of this, and the idea that we were coming together to kind of solve or find a way to cope with all of this is a nice idea to think about, but that's really not what was happening. There was a lot of as we talked about in the last chapter, a lot of anti-Semitism, as we talked about in the earlier chapter, a lot of Islamophobe or anti-Islamic sentiments that were out and about, and this is touched on in the mention of the pushcart vendors that had kind of disappeared, and just the idea of thinking about a New York City without pushcart vendors is kind of strange. I think that's a very jarring image to think of. I've been to New York a couple of times, and that's the one thing that is kind of constant on every single street I was ever on. Was there was always a pushcart vendor of some sort that had whether it was food or some kind of a newspapers or whatever it was. They were always there. To imagine them not being there is just really strange.
Yeah, they are certainly ubiquitous in New York City.
Yeah. Igor calls Maxine, asking about the DVD that she had and whether she still had it, and mentions that there was a hidden track on there. For anyone unfamiliar with DVD or CD technology, this is a very unique thing to that form of media, where you could have a sort of hidden item on there. Whether it was for CDs, you could have a track that was spaced out way after the last track, or in some cases they could actually put them in as a what was called a pre-track, where you had to actually like skip back from the first track to find what was on there. DVDs could have kind of a similar thing. They could have Easter eggs nestled into various menus and stuff, which could actually lead to some pretty cool things. But he's specifically mentioning that there was a hidden track on there, which appears to show the video that Reg took walking through hash slingers, and as he mentioned earlier, walking into the wrong room, wherein he sees a number of Arab men who are working on something called a Vercator, a virtual cathode oscillator. I don't know if Will or Luke or either of you are more familiar with this technology, but in a very broad sense, this is a device that's used to jam radar signals. It really does exist, but if you kind of think, I think the first thing that came to my mind when I was reading this was in Batman Begins, when they had the microwave device that was supposed to vaporize all the water supply and spread the toxin out through there. Kind of the same idea, but this is specifically to jam radar signals. So this is interesting because Igor talks about how these kind of devices do exist and what you can do with them. He seems to think that even though these are Arab men working on it, that the device itself is probably, I think he called it a knockoff, that was either from Russia or Estonia. And this device is going to come into play later. I don't want to get too far into the weeds about what comes up later in the book, but this specific device and that location will come into play later in the book. Do y'all have anything you wanted to go on? I don't know if either of you know more about that than I do that you want to talk about, or anything about this interaction between Igor and Maxine that you wanted to bring up?
Well, so I just really appreciate the way that Igor's written throughout this entire book, because he's one of the only people who doesn't change at all from the beginning to the end.
That's true.
So it's just nice to have him as a steady rock of cold slippery in his cold slippery stream of this very depressing but sometimes fun book. I think it's interesting though that Vercator is listed, because it's yes, it would make sense for Igor to be aware of these things. He's an arms dealer. This is the kind of thing that people would have been selling on the black market. At the same time, it is one of those things that is almost entirely unnecessary to actually mention specifically. It does feel like it's one of those good old Pynchon things where it's brought up so that it sends people onto, these days like a Wikipedia rabbit hole, or in the old days, just overwhelms people. Because it does sound like, if you don't look it up, a virtual cathode oscillator called a Vircator that it sends an EMF that can take out technology. It sounds like sci-fi nonsense.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
I do. This is a bit of an aside, but I do think that this weapon is used in like one of the Ocean's movies, like Ocean's 11 or Ocean's 12.
Something similar is used in Ocean's 11. They use it to knock out the power at the whatever the casino is that they're robbing. I think that is a more fictionalized version of what this is capable of. I think just in the scope of what it does, I could be wrong, but it seems like they kind of exaggerated its abilities in that movie.
I think you're right. Yeah.
From there, Driscoll shows up at Maxine's looking wildly different in that she no longer has her Jennifer Aniston Rachel haircut, just due to the sheer cost of maintaining it when she could buy a wig for $30 and there's really no difference. I'm curious generally, I would imagine, I guess, yeah, the upkeep of that kind of hairstyle, the cost of going to a salon on a regular basis to keep it up was probably pretty high. And I do remember that there were a lot of, wigs that were out there at that time that were meant to look like that. Some pretty bad. I'm sure there were some good ones that you could get. I don't know if you could get a good wig for $30 though. That seems a little bit ridiculous, but I don't know. I've never bought a wig.
Yeah, my impression of wigs is that you'd be looking at more in the range of $200 or something for.
Yeah, I would think. Yeah, you want to pay higher, dollar for a quality product that isn't gonna, fall apart the minute you get in like the rain or something.
Yeah, it's not mentioned at all how convincing the wig is.
Yeah, she only says that it can't, you can't really tell a difference, but whether that's actually true or not, I don't know. If I spent $30 on a wig, I guess I'm going to hope it looks like the real thing too. So, but yeah, she mentions that she is, like so many other people affected by the attacks, that has been displaced for any number of reasons. In Driscoll's case, basically proximity to the attack, of the site of the attack, has kept her from being able to stay at home. So she takes refuge with Maxine, who kind of happily takes her in. And then as a result, we find out that Maxine and Horst are back together because Driscoll needs somewhere to stay, and normally the room that Horst was staying in is now free, as him and Maxine have returned to sharing a room and sharing a bed. Eric then shows up, displaced in his case by a really shitty landlord, who, it's mentioned in here, evicted without notice by a landlord for whom the civic tragedy has come as a convenient excuse to get Eric and the other tenants out so he can convert to co-ops and pocket some public money. Also, this is something that I couldn't find specific instances of, but it would not surprise me if this was actually going on at the time. Eric and Driscoll hit it off pretty well. They find out that they share a love of Norwegian black metal, specifically mention the band Mayhem, which, if anyone listening is not familiar with the band Mayhem, there's a real wild history there. So I would definitely recommend going and looking into that.
Is it Mayhem or is it Burzum that has the wild history?
Mayhem.
So I thought it was Burzum.
No, Mayhem is the one where there. Yeah, that's true. A lot of them. There's a lot of murders and church burnings and all kinds of stuff. But Mayhem is the one, the band that kind of set that tone. Their lead singer kind of famously killed himself, and they used the picture of him dead, which was also his name. They used a picture of him dead for the cover of one of their EPs. He would, if I remember correctly, he would bury his clothes that he was going to perform in for like weeks at a time, and then dig them up before a show so that they would smell like death. I think more than one of them was responsible for burning a church down, multiple churches probably. I can't remember specifically if it was the bassist that killed the drummer or the drummer killed the bassist, but one of them killed the other one very viciously, never really apologized for it. I think he ended up saying something to the effect of like he just wished he had done it better or something. It's fucked up. But there's a wild history to that band. And yeah, like Will said, Norwegian, Scandinavian black metal in general is absolutely wild.
I know that the lead, like one of the guys in Burzum murdered one of the other guys and like went to jail for it.
That's
Burzum's been in the news lately because of Kanye wearing a shirt of theirs. So I did a deep dive of that, because Burzum is also kind of infamous for them being professedly
neo-Nazi.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Varg Vikernes, the guy who basically is Burzum, did also do some church burnings. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's not just mayhem. It's not just Burzum.
Yeah,
it is
it's a lot of them.
it is a slight issue.
I never really got into Norwegian black metal or any Scandinavian black metal. I just really got into reading about it. So yeah, there's again, go read about it because there's a lot that went on, and I think still goes on with a lot of those bands.
Actually, I've been listening to Burzum some lately, which I
Oh,
think
yeah?
that'll rub some listeners the wrong way. I know that they're very controversial. That being said, I have to say I do enjoy the music, sadly enough. I do kind of get that icky feeling whenever you're streaming someone's
Yeah,
music and you don't like them, but I have to say I actually do like their early stuff kind of a good amount.
I guess it comes down to a separate the art from the artist kind of thing. And
Yeah.
yeah, aside from their love of Scandinavian black metal, they also love ambient and fucking. So they do a lot of that. There is a mention here when they meet Ziggy and Otis, the frolicking twosome exclaim more or less in unison, "You guys are real?" Among widely reported ambient hallucinations being numbers of small people busy running around doing a variety of household tasks. This is a direct reference to Terence McKenna, who talked about this kind of thing. I don't want to go too far into the weeds about that, but there's some interesting writing about his experiences using various hallucinogens and Ambien and all kinds of other stuff. Terence McKenna, interesting dude.
I did not know that he experimented with Ambien. That's one that's news to me.
Yeah, that one was news to me too. I was familiar with his use of like mushrooms and LSD and stuff like that, but
Well, I think it's specifically the small people busy running
I think
around
that's
doing
what
a
it is. Maybe that's what
yeah,
it
because
is.
that's
Yeah,
a people on DMT. I think other hallucinogens report seeing like small people running around doing stuff, and I think
yeah,
there's like something about like the fact that a lot of people hallucinate the same thing. Like there's supposed to be like some kind of like metaphysical
connection between all of it.
connection between yeah.
We also get here another mention of Horst's. It's called insane jealousy, just because he, in seeing that Eric and Driscoll have hooked up, kind of alleviates his fears, I guess, that Maxine is going to hook up with Eric. So, another reminder of Horst and never an explicit mention of him other than the one time that Maxine, specifically said that he choked her. But again, we're getting more of these images of him and his jealousy and his violent temper that kind of comes out from time to time. After that, Heidi comes back, single again. She's moved on from Carmine Mazzoli. Can't imagine why, but she has a really interesting conversation with Maxine, and this goes back to what I said earlier about how we're going to start seeing how the aftermath of 9/11 had a number of impacts on different aspects of life, as is common with Pynchon's work, and showing how these momentous events have changed things in history. So as a result of everything that's happened, Carmine has had this sort of shift in the way he perceives his job and his responsibilities. Rather than thinking of himself as what he is, he's now kind of putting himself in this higher state of authority and thinking that he's, as she puts it, out on the front line of the war against terror, and that she's not being respectful enough. This is interesting because I think this point in history is where we started seeing a lot of this, of what Heidi's mentioning that is happening to Carmine, of the police specifically starting to view themselves more and more as a military force than as a peace enforcement force, for lack of a better term. This is where we start seeing these police divisions and police units getting these military vehicles and military weapons and really treating themselves as though they are some sort of a military faction that has that sort of power and that authority when they really don't. And this has not gone away. I think we're all familiar with how things have played out over the last couple of decades, but the police should not have these large, like SWAT vehicles and things like that, and military grade vehicles and military grade weapons. But that's where we are now, and they're exerting that power as a result of that.
Yeah, I love the line. every time a kid tries to jump a turnstile, subway service gets suspended, and police vehicles of every description surface and airborne converge and linger.
Yeah.
It's a really good kind of symbol for all of that, because that's how it feels like. Maybe it's starting to shift back again a little bit with some of the half-hearted reforms in the past few years in the US. But that's how it feels that police view themselves, is as some kind of like, they need to cover it, even if they can't do anything about the issue.
Yeah.
To go back a bit, I did find it odd that Eric chooses Maxine as the place to go, because like, unless I'm wrong about this, they've only interacted like 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, but I think if we look at how Eric is as a person, he seems like the
doesn't
type
have-
that would easily latch on to somebody the moment they show any sort of interest in him.
That is probably true, and it also could speak to the fact that he doesn't really have a lot of people because he's such a weirdo.
Also that, yeah.
Yeah.
He's definitely not going to Joie de Vivre. I mean, he's, we know he's not allowed there anymore. So then we get a mention of Heidi is working on an article for the Journal of Meme Space Cartography that she's calling Heteronormative Rising Star, Homophobic Dark Companion. This is a really interesting idea that she's got for this article, and I wanted to get y'all's opinion on how accurate this all is from a perspective of, at that time, and then the 10 years after that time that the book was written, and even now 10 years on from there. Like, do you think this is how does this idea hold up? Does this seem like it's as resonant as it was then now, or have we moved away from that?
I don't necessarily remember being in school and having the same experience that Ziggy and the other kid had, Otis, with the change in curriculum and stuff. And I don't know. I don't know how actual true to life all that stuff is. That being said, this does kind of bring to mind David Foster Wallace's view on irony, and how irony. I think he pronounced irony dead or something in the 90s, or kind of limited how big of a role it played in society at large, especially during the 90s. I did find it really, like you said, I think interesting to think about. I just don't necessarily know if I have a great grip on what, like, all the different kind of like effects it would have had.
Yeah, I struggled to really see how anybody in 2001 would have grasped onto any of it, but especially 20 years on, I think that this is the most coherent and straightforwardly accurate thing Heidi has said in the entire book.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think any of it is anywhere near as conscious as Heidi is framing it, but as somebody analyzing it from the third party perspective, that makes sense. But I do think that to a large extent there is like this idea of like, and I think it's finally starting to abate, but this idea that like, oh, why are you wasting your time reading novels when you could be like watching a documentary or reading like actual articles written that are nonfiction? And I think that, I don't know if irony is so much a key part of that, but I do think that there is an aspect of like the cultural psyche refusing to acknowledge the validity of the insights delivered through fiction. And I think that irony is not a bad lens to attack that issue.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think it's, as someone who, like I said, was in high school when this happened, and then I, grew from there watching all this, like the rise in reality TV, which is still a huge thing, but I think we've kind of pulled away from that a little bit. But then also, yeah, the anti-reading thing, I think, is kind of really interesting part of this, is that in the years after 9/11, it definitely felt like there was a shift away from people wanting to or feeling the need to read fiction and to focus more on nonfiction, or at least it was presented that way. I think a lot of people, if I was reading a fiction book, especially if I was reading something that was like sci-fi or fantasy, there was always a call to question of like, why are you wasting your time on that? Like, there's real things going on, and why aren't you paying attention to that, and blah blah blah. And it's always like, well, I'm reading this because I want to forget about that shit for a little while. Like, I'm bashed over the head with it all day, every day. But I think it's interesting to see how that, shifting into that sort of hyper focus on realist, quote unquote realist, because a lot of that stuff was never really real to begin with. But there was a sort of stripping away of the collective imagination that took place after that. I think we're getting back to restoring that. I think we're seeing a lot more fiction and especially like science fiction and fantasy that's kind of coming back into the focus in the mainstream and being allowed to thrive again. But it was a really interesting time where we kind of lost a lot of that. And so, I think reading, Heidi's oddly coherent and cogent discussion of what she was talking about was a really interesting section of this to read.
Yeah, and I really love, especially this is a Thomas Pynchon book. The idea that anybody could possibly be reading Thomas Pynchon's 8th novel in 2013 and thinking, well, this is just a goof, is very funny. I like that idea. But
yeah,
further, the choice of Rugrats and Rocko's Modern Life I think are not meaningful, but totemic of kind of the failure of understanding that entire attitude of why are you wasting your time reading something fake? Because I was never somebody who read primarily for escapism, and I really promise, no judgment, I get it. I'm just, I grew up in the era of having TV and stuff for escapism. So for me, reading was always something more concerted, which is a lot of why I love Thomas Pynchon's books. But Rocko's Modern Life, I was a bit young for it, but it always struck me as very much like a descendant of Looney Tunes, which, as we know, Thomas Pynchon is a huge fan of Looney Tunes. And the thing with Looney Tunes and the thing with Rocko's Modern Life, and to a less extremely juxtaposed extent, Rugrats, those are all about real things. They're just not necessarily coded in the way that the Crying of Lot 49 Looney Tunes segment talks about, but more in the sense that they are making jokes that kids can laugh at because it's slapstick, but are also very much insightful social criticisms that the adults who are watching over their kid's shoulder can also laugh at for the critical aspect.
Yeah, definitely. Those shows absolutely did an insane balancing act of kids' humor, like you were mentioning, the slapstick stuff, and really sometimes very adult humor. That in hindsight, it's astonishing that they were able to get away with doing some of the stuff they did. Not just Rocko's Modern Life, but Ren and Stimpy, Invader Zim did a lot of it too. There was a lot of stuff that I can go back and watch. Jesus, I can't believe that aired on cable television as a kids show. So then the chapter ends as Maxine has a conversation with our old friend Rocky Slagiat, who kind of feels that the country is being infantilized. And I wanted to get y'all's opinions on this, on the end of this chapter and the conversation that Maxine and Rocky have, but specifically, or not specifically, but I do also want to touch on, Kate left a note on this as well. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Let me back up. She's not having a conversation with Rocky. She's talking about Rocky. Still talking to Heidi. But Kate mentions specifically in reference to the quote, "I didn't mean that. The day was a terrible tragedy, but it isn't the whole story. Can't you feel it? How everyone is regressing. 11 September infantilized this country." Kate says, Heidi is essentially correct about this. We know that PTSD can be inflicted through video images. It's why drone pilots have the highest rates of it in the military. So when Brooke says that it traumatized the generation earlier in the chapter, she's correct. That constant footage of the towers burning had a massively damaging psychological effect on the population. In a way, 9/11 both regressed us all to children and it aged us. Trauma ages you, but it also makes you seek out protectors or someone who may make it all okay. And the deeper you regress, the less time you have to be worried about reality. The government, the military-industrial complex, and the intelligence community all said they would take care of the people who did this to us. They said we didn't have to be worried about it. "Quote-unquote, daddy is here to protect us." Yet at the same time, that trauma still affects us, still makes us some grow up too fast. There will always be times when you can't keep the facade of your aggression up, and the real age shows. That latter point is where the importance of tech, or specifically Deep Archer, comes in. When Maxine wakes up after the towers have fallen, all she wishes for is an escape into someplace else. Deep Archer is her first thought. Show them the horror, traumatize them, and then give them something to anesthetize themselves so that they have even less opportunity to think about it, about how they are who they really might, how they are who really might be responsible. That's how you operate above the oversight of the public. If ICE buys the source code for Deep Archer, he's got a vertically integrated system for them. Excuse me, just like the Golden Fang and Inherent Vice when it came to the drug trade. So I think Kate makes a excellent point in there about that, what's being discussed about that sort of infantilization of the country and how those traumatic moments can definitely regress people, even on a mass scale like that. So I'm curious what y'all thought about the end of this chapter and that part specifically.
Well, it's a thing. I know I don't have much direct experience with AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, but I know it's a thing for people to say that like the time when you began using whatever drug that you become addicted to, you kind of get stuck in that age level and that level of maturity. I do think that the same can be said for trauma, where trauma can kind of make you stuck at a certain level of maturity, or like Kate and Pynchon seem to be pointing out, it can cause you to regress even to a less mature state.
Yeah, in general, I am very much not a fan of the charting of maturity as a linear process, or even as a consistent process, or even the idea that regression is something that happens. But I do think that to a large extent there is real validity in the psychological manipulation complex that Kate kind of outlined there. You know, you don't need to think about it in terms of maturity or adulthood or childhood to say that when you scare people badly enough, they want someone to fix it. And if somebody with a lot of power says that they have the ability to fix it, you're going to want them to be right, even if you don't like who the person is, even if you don't like the way they're going to go about it. You still, on some level, want that to happen. And, you know, as Pynchon throughout his entire career has alluded to, you know, there is a process of fascism that, you know, has its roots deep in America. And the daddy, in this case being, you know, the military industrial complex. In other fascist contexts, it could be Hitler or Stalin, if you want to twist the definition of fascism slightly. The daddy who will keep you safe is a real thing, even if it's not about regression, even if it's not about specifically like, oh, you have stunted people's maturity. It is still a thing. People still want to be taken care of, no matter how old they are. And just because a lot of people, you know, they believe that they are, you know, adults, that they are strong enough to take on the world, doesn't mean that they can't also secretly want daddy to pick them up and tell them the bad man is gone.
Yeah, it's a really powerful way, I think, to end not just this chapter, but I think this whole set of chapters that we've been covering on this episode, and really just kind of leaves the reader with a lot to think about as far as everything that's just occurred in the last two chapters. You know, the major event that was 9/11 and the reverberations that have started as a result of it. Anything else that y'all wanted to bring up in these chapters?
I did want to bring up the fact that, you know, it is, I get that Maxine and Horace were already kind of, even as, you know, even in last week's chapters, we're already kind of back together in many ways, but they do seem to be fully back together by the end of this section. It is a bit maddening, you know, from an outside perspective, that she would take him back. I get that we've talked about how he's, you know, not a super serious person, and he's not necessarily that big of a villain and stuff. But, you know, we've already been over the fact that, you know, Horse made Maxine a domestic violence victim, which is, you know, a pretty big deal and stuff. And I do think that the fact that they eventually got divorced probably speaks to the fact that they had a dysfunctional, abusive, and the word toxic gets thrown around way too much nowadays, but probably toxic relationship in the past. And from an outside perspective, that can, like whenever somebody gets back together with somebody that's been abusive to them, it can be pretty enraging. That being said, those kind of relationships, dysfunctional, toxic relationships, can be very addictive. And so, like, it is, and you do see people that have been abused get back together with their abuser after periods of being broken up or being not together. Yeah, I mean, and it's not like Maxine is really like, Maxine has been dating throughout this book, but it's not like she's having a lot of success with dating. Whether or not it's personal or societal, it can kind of drive you back to what's familiar and what's comfortable. But I did want to point that out, that, like Maxine, it did kind of make me a little bit mad that she takes him back, but it's within character for her, and it's also just kind of within character for people that have been through similar things.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I think it's very hard to from the outside or from the inside to tell whether those kinds of events, the thunder, those kinds of returns to a relationship with someone that it might have the relationship may have been abusive in the past. It's tricky because it's one of those things where, as I've talked about a few times, I've definitely inhabited the mentality of like, hey, yeah, I can fix them. That kind of thing is not a terribly foreign idea to me. And I can totally imagine being Maxine and both thinking, hey, Horst has spent the last, I kind of get the sense it's been 5 years or so since they were together.
Sounds about right, yeah.
He's been alone for a while, and it seems like he's grown up a lot seems like he's really starting to have some self-awareness, and I can totally empathize with Maxine looking at Horst, especially after that very emotionally vulnerable conversation in the previous chapter. I can totally see her thought process of saying, well, he's changed. And it's one of those things that it's very hard to say, because nobody wants to say that anyone is irredeemable. At the same time, it's pretty hard to fight the fact that, like we've been saying, you go back to daddy when you're afraid. When 9/11 happens, you want the military-industrial complex to fix your problems.
Mm-hmm.
Is Maxine just doing that with Horst? We can't tell.
Yeah, I mean, as with so much else in these chapters, there is a lot to support both sides of that argument, and I think that's a central part of. I think I mentioned this earlier, that's a central part of this book, is just the lack of answers sometimes for things and why they happen, and what the reason is for it. And I think it's something that he's touched on, not just with this book, but I think Lot 49 kind of dives into that as well. There's never really a clear answer as to why things happen to certain people, and why they have those experiences and what they're supposed to mean. But I think we always are kind of searching for that, and it's frustrating when we can't have that. And so it's, I can sit here and see, Maxine taking Horst back. Like, sure, like you mentioned, they've been separated for a while, and he's been by himself, and she's, dealing with a lot of things simultaneously, and now we have this huge act of terrorism that's just occurred. So, there is some sort of sense of justification in her going back to him, but at the same time, you're frustrated with her for doing it, because why? But we don't, we're not her. We don't have, the full context of her feelings and her thoughts and her history. We have what we're given in the book. So, yeah, it's just a really kind of a difficult thing to process. And I can't help but wonder if maybe that's part of the reason that this book gets downplayed so much, is because of its lack of answers for a lot of things that go on throughout it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, again, so much of this book is from Maxine's perspective, and we see, as far as we can tell, her honest feelings about Horst. And her honest feelings about Horst are about as conflicted as anything else in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to say from the outside in a diagnostic sense, like, oh, abusive relationships go like this. Abusers do these things for this reason. But it's almost like Horst has been designed to not fit any of those things, with the exception of being an abuser and being a callous man. And so it seems like one of those kind of Rorschach-y kind of things.
Definitely.
It's easier and it's a safer bet to say, Maxine, how could you? How could you let this man, act like a father again to your children with him? How can you let him back into your trust? And we can't tell, just like she can't, whether it's a good idea or not. And it probably isn't, but it might be. Who knows?
Yep. Were there any other funny parts that we didn't go over that you wanted to bring up?
The funniest part to me is we already mentioned it, but the A team thing
Yeah.
to Canada,
Yep.
that actually made me chuckle a little bit. Which I don't usually like laugh out loud for jokes in books, but it's just really really fucking funny. I'd love a shirt with that on it.
That would be good.
I think for me, the funniest part, in the darkest possible way, might be the conversation where Maxine is antagonizing her sister and brother-in-law.
Yeah, that's definitely a very, very, very dark humor for sure. What about quote?
There are so many quotes to choose from, though. I'm having trouble choosing just one. Well, I think my favorite quote might be the opening paragraph of chapter 30.
Hmm.
If you read nothing but the newspaper of record, you might believe that New York City, like the nation united in sorrow and shock, has risen to the challenge of global jihadism, joining a righteous crusade Bush's people are now calling the war on terror. If you go to other sources, the internet, for example, you might get a different picture. Out in the vast, undefined anarchism of cyberspace, among the billions of self-resonant fantasies, dark possibilities are beginning to emerge. It's very ominous, and it's very Pynchonian to kind of want to undercut the official narrative and kind of point out that the black versus white, kind of like he doesn't really deal with in opposites very much,
Mhm.
and that seems to kind of be he's kind of pointing out the fact that we look back on that time and we think about how united we all were and all this stuff, but in reality, America is very rarely or basically never uniformly united in basically anything. So
That's definitely true.
I'm gonna go for really like the most obvious possible choice, being the first paragraph of chapter 28. Um, It's a warm evening, just around the time sunset colors are developing over Jersey, and food delivery bike traffic in the neighborhood approaches its peak, and city trees are filled with bird dialogue that reaches a crescendo as the street lights come on. Contrails of evening departures hanging brightly in the sky. Horst and Maxine, having dropped the kids at Ernie and Elaine's, are on the subway headed down to Soho. It's just a really beautiful bit of scenery.
Really is. I find, especially in this book, his opening paragraphs tend to be really, really strong.
Definitely.
It's common in most of his books, but I think this one is I'd have to go through and like really do the math on it probably, but I think chapter to chapter, I think this might have the most just jaw-dropping openings of any of his work.
Yeah, it's hard to argue because it really is consistent throughout this whole book.
Yeah. Mine is going back to when her and March were talking after the attacks. This is on 321 and 322. On her web blog, March Kelleher has wasted no time shifting into what she calls her old lefty tirade mode. Just to say evil Islamics did it, that's so lame, and we know it. We see those official close-ups on the screen, the shifting liars look, the 12-steppers gleam in the eye. One look at these faces and we know they're guilty of the worst crimes we can imagine. But who's in any hurry to imagine? To make the awful connection? Any more than the Germans were back in 1933 when Nazis torched the Reichstag within a month of Hitler becoming chancellor. Which, of course, is not at all to suggest that Bush and his people have actually gone out and staged the events of 11 September. It would take a mind of hopelessly diseased with paranoia, indeed a screamingly anti-American nutcase, even to allow to cross to her mind the possibility that that terrible day could have deliberately been engineered as a pretext to impose some endless Orwellian war and the emergency decrees we will soon be living under. Nah, perish that thought. But there's always the other thing, our yearning, our deep need for it to be true. Somewhere, down at that shameful dark recess of the national soul, we need to feel betrayed, even guilty. As if it was us who created Bush and his gang, Cheney and Rove and Rumsfeld and Faith and the rest of them. We who called down the sacred lightning of democracy, and then the fascist majority on the Supreme Court threw the switches, and Bush rose from the slab and began his rampage, as whatever happened then is on our ticket. I can't help but feel like, again, a lot of March is just Pynchon using the opportunity to get a lot of his ideas and thoughts out on the page, personally rather than like as a character. And I think March is really presenting the sort of dichotomy that exists, and again, to go back to this idea of the lack of answers and whether or not one thing is true over the other, and not being able to really know. We want to have an explanation of how this happened, and in some cases we want to be able to say, yeah, it was the big bad government that did it. But at the end of the day, we can't really say that, no matter how much we want it to be true, and no matter how responsible we might feel for creating that Frankenstein's monster that gets alluded to here. It really speaks, I think, to a lot of the sentiment that went on after 9/11 and still kind of is occurring nowadays. March is a fascinating character, and I think a lot of her conversations and dialogue in this book are really getting at the core of what is going on and what this book is about.
Yeah, I mean that section I was definitely considering for my most Pynchon part. I felt like it was maybe a little too pessimistic to really embody truly his beliefs, because otherwise, why would he have written the whole book, right? But yeah, I mean it's a perfect encapsulation of kind of this central tension.
Well, on that note, what was your most Pynchon part?
Well, unfortunately, my honest answer has already been covered. It was between that quote of March's, the extended paragraph that Luke read for us earlier in the episode, and then the following section about the Inshallah exchange.
Mm-hmm.
I have a hard time choosing between those two, and I think I'd have to go with the long paragraph. The for some reason, however, she manages to stay all night and close the joint down. Starting one.
The most Pynchon part to me, I had it in my head. Oh, it's probably like I went over like the whole like Maxine possibly being anti-Semitic, which does seem to be like a thing that, like I said, Pynchon plays with a lot in his later work. And I don't, Pynchon I assume is a wasp, and it's just pretty ballsy of him to kind of even address that kind of stuff, in my opinion. Or not a lot of other authors would have the balls to kind of go over that.
Yeah, I think for me, it's the conversations that Maxine has with the other characters throughout these chapters, whether it's her conversation with Brooke or her conversations with March and Heidi. All of those in different ways kind of feel like a lot of Pynchon's airing out a lot of his ideas and trying to wrap his head around everything that went on around 9/11 and everything that's come from it since then, and he can kind of use these characters to sort of converse with himself and throw these ideas back and forth and try to balance both sides of what's going on, and like we've talked about so much in this episode about this, which of these two sides of the coin is the right side, or and I think these conversations that take place are key to understanding both of those sides and seeing that there really isn't one true side to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, couldn't have put it better.
Well, that brings us to the end of these chapters. We are going to be off the next couple of weeks, so we will be coming back on the 26th. We do have a couple of bonus episodes that we're going to fill in. Kate found some articles similar to when she did the readings for like Nearer My Couch to Thee and Is It Okay to Be a Luddite? It's essentially just going to be short readings of those articles that she found to kind of fill in the time that we're gone. But then we will be back, like I said, on July 26th to cover chapters 31 to 33. If you like what we're doing and you want to support the show financially, we would like to offer the option to set up or to visit our Ko-Fi page. We're going to use whatever funds we get on there to upgrade our equipment, pay for hosting fees, just various quality of life improvements to make the show a little bit better as we go on. And as always, you can reach us by email at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. We're on Twitter at PynchonPod and on Instagram at mappingthezonepodcast. Thank you all, as always, so much for listening. We really appreciate it. And we will see you in a few weeks. Bye.
Bye.